I'd like to call this meeting to order, and it is 6:34. Thank you very much. Would you please call roll?
Commissioner Finley? Commissioner Finley?
Yes, here.
Commissioner Elsner is absent. Commissioner Quaid?
Here.
Vice Chair Rossi?
Here.
Chair Giulioni.
Here. Yeah. Are there any public comments?
We're none received online and none in person so far.
I am not tonight.
Something happened in the city for the first time in a quarter century. City council adopted a deficit budget. Everybody went into a panic state. City council didn't do what the finance commission told them to do, and they adopted it anyway, knowing, as the maker of the motion, Janet Braun, did, that 2.1 million was easily 5 million. And we've seen that with the liabilities that have come up in the insurance fund. It wasn't just that, it was the city manager who was angry to the point of abuse, and people were hurt. It's the same commonality with 2020 in this community. People were hurt. Employees, one of the commissioners. It's wrong. The staff could not have an adult conversation for 2 months. Doesn't fly in any political organization or any private sector. It's time for your staff to deliberate and discuss alternatives in an adult fashion. These are difficult issues, ladies and gentlemen. The Finance Commission has done a fine job of trying to work their way out of where the City Council has you. But there has to be some very difficult discussions coming up. We have now the 6th consultant since 2015 in the city of South Pasadena. And lo and behold, Mr. Statler was telling you that everything's okay in his report. And you really should take a moment, a lot of moments, to digest the fact that these are extremely complicated issues. And if you do not understand what may be a sleight of hand and the perpetuation of a staff position that they argued, you really should identify yourself right now. If you're not ready for this task, this is big league. This is more important than Tesla's. We've seen that a loan to the insurance fund for 2 years worth of cash concentration in this 48 months is suddenly something we need to amortize over 10 years. Kind of like taking your home mortgage and making it 60 years. And what we have is the story of where cash is inflowing and outflowing in the organization. And the measure of that, which the city manager never thought to do, and how that affects the reserve standing of this fund, general fund, and others. Mr. Statler has created an egregious error by not analyzing more than 25 of the city's subsidiary funds and the special revenue funds, grant funds that were discussed here 2 months ago to be in a state of failure. This as a beginning basis fails the basic scope of service, Bill. I'm sorry to tell you. You have to do the entire general fund. I wish you well, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the work you're doing.
We do not have any hands raised on Zoom.
Sure. Thank you, Honorable Chairman. So we have Bill Statler, our consultant, who is going to present our 5-year long-range fiscal plan. He will be going through a presentation. We ask that all questions wait until after the presentation is done, so that it's a concise presentation. And then following that, it's wide open for questioning. Mr. Statler.
I'm not sure if I agree with having all the questions wait till the end of the presentation, because I do have very specific concerns about information that's been presented in the presentation by page. So, I mean, if we can go ahead and do the concise if you would like, but I'm going to want a page by page review, starting by page 6. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Very well.
Commissioners, what is our role in this review?
So tonight's presentation is really going to be Mr. Statler's assumptions that and basis that he's using in determining his long-range 5-year plan.
Mhm.
And it's really kind of more of a discussion. The Finance Commission does get to weigh in on those, and they can, make recommendations on there that will be taken into consideration during the process.
And, Chair, if I can just chime in, I think the other thing is the council was really looking for the Finance Commission's review of the assumptions on which the 5-year projections are being built, because the assumptions have a huge impact on the projections.
Okay, so if I understand you, then you're asking the Finance Commission to review the assumptions and to feed back to the City Council our belief of how correct or incorrect those assumptions might be. Perfect. And is it your position that we need to come to a City Council meeting and actually make that presentation?
I think, and John, correct me if I'm wrong. Last I talked to Armani, I think she wanted a joint Finance Commission City Council meeting when this comes to the council. So
That
I
is
believe
correct.
that is in the works.
Okay.
I don't know which meeting that is.
So
Yes.
November 1st.
Yes.
Okay. 1st.
Yes, so that is correct. So we're planning on having a joint meeting for the November 1st for his entire presentation on his long-term or 5-year financial plan.
Okay. So
6:30 start time,
I'm sorry.
6:30 start time on November 1st.
I think I think they're trying to recommend 6 o'clock, but it's really, we want to get your feedback whether you want 6 or 6:30.
okay. And John, just as a very small thing, this is the first time I've heard this.
Sure.
Okay. So please, the fewest surprises about meetings, the better. And
Absolutely.
thank you very much. So our role is to listen carefully, ask Bill questions, ask for clarification, and then we will listen to the conclusions made, listen to the assumptions made, and make our recommendation to the City Council. Correct?
That is correct.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Bill, you're up front and center. And Bill, when
Yeah,
Bill, Bill,
hmm.
Bill, Bill,
just to maybe recap a little bit about where we were.
no, Bill, when there is a question, the commissioner will
Yeah,
ask.
all of a sudden, for whatever reason, the sound kind of kicked out on me, but go ahead and ask me the
Okay.
question.
When the commissioners have a question, they will hold up their hand as a sign to you that we have a question, and then they'll ask the question. I'll repeat it so that you'll have a chance to formulate your response. Okay?
Okay.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Yeah. Well,
Commissioners, is that okay?
we certainly, can do that. The other suggestion I have is there will be a couple of points in the presentation where it's kind of an obvious time to kind of ask you what your thoughts are. And that would be my suggestion, that we do that at that time, because I'll have just covered that information. But let me just do a little bit of a recap. When I was here back on August 24th, I did sort of a presentation on what the project is, the approach to the project, sort of the methodology. And one of the things that surfaced at that time, which was quite frankly Councilmember Braun's idea, was to really kind of take a 2-step process to this. And rather than waiting until the final plan was done, is to come back to the Finance Commission and sort of share what really the key assumptions were and the key drivers are. And maybe talk about that a little bit, because at the end of the day, Councilmember Braun's absolutely right. Whatever we make as the key assumptions, since this isn't a policy document per se, that's for the council to make decisions about what the policy should be, but it is about assumptions, about what we believe are reasonable assumptions for the purpose of preparing the plan and the forecast. So, and so that's what we decided to do at this stage, was for me to come back and really put together a report on what are the key factors that are going to be driving this assumption. And some of it has to do with what's the general fiscal outlook like? What's the economic situation look like? But then obviously that translates somehow or another into assumptions about how we think the local economy is going to perform and how that's going to affect your key revenues and how that's going to affect your key expenditures. So that's really just sort of a recap of what we're doing this evening. This is not the financial plan itself, but it's sort of a preface, it's sort of the foundation for that, and an opportunity for you to get sort of an early look at what the thinking is about the plan. Okay. This would appear to have defeated me. Maybe you
I
can
can
just, can you
assist
just
via
go to
the
the,
computer.
can you just go to the next slide? Let's just step back for a moment and remember what the plan's purpose is when I do come back with that. It's a 5-year financial analysis and long-term plan. Which one? Okay. 5-year analysis and long-term financial plan that assesses the general fund's ability over the next 5 years to continue current service levels, address long-term liabilities, and achieve CIP goals. I do want to emphasize, this would probably be a good point to do that. The focus of this is on the general fund. It's not the water fund, it's not the sewer fund. And if there are 25 different special revenue funds, by definition, those are not the general fund. Those are special revenue funds. So this is focused on the general fund. So again, what's the purpose of the fiscal outlook? It's to preface the upcoming financial plan and look at what some of the key factors are that are going to be affecting the results of that plan, and ultimately translate those into key assumptions that drive forecast results. And we sort of mentioned this already, but the that consideration of the plan, one of the things that we also discussed back on August 24th was having a joint meeting between the Finance Commission and the City Council to hear it, so that it's both of you get the information at the same time, can process the results at the same time, and the date that's been I don't think tentatively selected. I think the date that's been selected for that joint meeting is the November 1st council meeting. You may recall one of the things that we discussed when we talked about the work scope is, well, and when I held the interviews with the Finance Commission members and the council members, what are the main concerns you have? Because if I come back with the, I'm not sure what happened there. If I come back with the long-term financial plan, and there are still questions you have, well, what about this? What about that? It won't have been a successful endeavor. So one of the key things I wanted to do was make sure that I address those questions. And the 4 issues that sort of surfaced in those interviews and sort of surfaced at the August 24th meeting were, first off, do we have a balanced budget? Is the 23-24 budget, is it balanced? Do we have a structurally balanced budget to begin that analysis and that longer term analysis to begin with? Insurance was obviously on the radar and concerns about that. Concerns about CalPERS pensions and how that is likely to affect the city. And then lastly, the capital improvement plan and infrastructure plans. And so these 4 areas are going to get covered by the time I'm done making this presentation, and they're covered in the report. So these were kind of 4 issues that were specifically on my mind. In thinking about, look at the key forecast drivers and assumptions, there's really 8 items that kind of stick out. And the first one is just, what are the general economic trends and what's the outlook for the city's general fund in the context of coming up. Secondly, take a look at what's happening with the state budget situation and how much of a threat that is or isn't to cities in California. Take a look at your current financial condition. Where do you start this 5-year process from? Then take a look at key revenue trends and key assumptions for those. Take a look at key operating cost drivers and take a look at assumptions for those. Talk about general fund subsidies and transfers out. The city correctly puts its budget and annual financial report together. There's revenues, there's expenditures, transfers in and out. Those are really kind of a separate category, but they can be significant. So we need to talk about those transfers out in terms of general fund subsidies. Take a look at what impact population and economic development is likely to have. And then lastly, take a look at capital improvement plan expenditures. So the first one is sort of the economic trends and outlook. I guess the question that comes to me is where's the recession? For the last 2 years, I think all we've heard from most economists is we need to get ready for the coming recession. And the Federal Reserve actually kind of engineering that by having significant increases in the federal funds rate, really as in order to try and combat inflation significantly higher than their 2% target. But it hasn't happened yet. And really, it looks like by all indications that the soft landing that many had hoped for, it looks like that's going to happen. So let's talk about what's happening with inflation and taming it. I'm not sure that you can see this, but if you look at the period before COVID-19 hit, the inflation rate was running just about at the Federal Reserve's target of around 2% for a significantly sustained period of time. And in fact, in about a year in the run-up before COVID-19 hit and the lockdown of the economy in response to that public health threat, was actually far below 2%. We had a period there was actually almost zero. But of course, in early 2020, as soon as all of the public health prohibitions came out, inflation soared. There was a belief there for a while that might be temporary, that it wasn't really going to stick with us. And there was a point there for a while where it kind of moderated a bit. But then it peaked in April of 2020. It hit an annual rate of 9% a year. And stayed at that level for a while. Once inflation got better, once demand sort of simmered a little bit, more importantly, when supply chain issues and other supply issues got improved, inflation fell rapidly to where in the last 3 months it's been under 4%, ranging somewhere between 3% to 3.5%. It's still higher than the Fed's target of 2%. But it really does show a significant reduction. This run-up in inflation really just sort of a classic textbook case. We had all of this pent-up demand during COVID-19. People wanted to buy stuff, but they weren't allowed to go to restaurants. They weren't allowed to go to shows. They weren't allowed to go to work. So there was still this huge demand while you had supply chain issues. So it was really kind of the perfect storm of significant demand while at the same time limited supplies. Should point out, and on almost all of these slides will reinforce this notion, there's a significant difference between the economic impacts we saw with the Great Recession and the economic impacts we saw with COVID-19. The Great Recession was absolutely based on a total meltdown of the US economy, our financial markets, housing markets, unemployment. It was really an economy that was faltering. It had systemic problems. COVID-19, really a different case. You kind of see a little glimmer here with these inflation rates. There was nothing inherently at flaw with the American economy before we went into COVID-19. And for want of a better word, we engineered those recessions and we engineered the inflation that followed in our responses to the shutdown. Now, 1 million people died in the United States from COVID-19. This was the most serious public health crisis in 100 years. I don't mean to indicate that the responses weren't appropriate, but let's be frank, we engineered these downturns by shutting down the economy in order to save people's lives. So that once those pressures were off, we were able to return to a relatively rapid recovery. That didn't happen with the Great Recession. It took a number of months, years before we really recovered to where we were before that. But one of the reasons you're seeing such quick recovery from the inflation and quick recovery in other places, the economy was actually pretty fundamentally strong before we went into COVID-19, and that just wasn't the case with the Great Recession. Where is inflation headed? You know, that's a tough item. I couldn't say with some surety, I believe it is headed towards 2%. Not because the economy would necessarily do that, not because supply and demand would get in link, but the Fed has made it really clear their target is 2%. And the Fed will do whatever, I believe it will do whatever it has to do with interest rates, which are currently around 7% for mortgage interest rates. 2 years ago, when my son bought a house, he was under 3%. Whether you're paying 3% for a mortgage or 7% for mortgage has a pretty big role in what his affordability looks like. I do believe the Fed is committed to a 2% target, and they will do what they need to do with their short-term Fed rates in order to make that happen. Statistica, reasonably well-regarded company, economic forecasting company, you know, they basically see inflation rates coming down and approaching that 2% target. Now, whether this is being prescient on their part, that they're looking at all the economic factors, or whether they're kind of looking at it the way I'm looking at it, and that's the Fed is going to get this interest rate down to 2%, is going to get inflation down by 2%. How much damage happens to the economy on that way? You know, hopeful that we'll have a soft landing. U.S. unemployment rate, it peaked at almost 15%. At that late, when it peaked at that was actually worse than the highest level of unemployment that we had during the Great Recession. The Great Recession was 10%. This was almost 15%. But once the economy started to recover, once we started easing up on some of the social distancing issues, unemployment fell rapidly. It's been in the threes for 19 months. This is the longest sustained period of unemployment at this level since the 1960s. So it's a little surprising, you know, where's the recession? Unemployment or employment is still very, very, very strong. And there really aren't any signs on the horizon to indicate that this is going to change. Retail sales, really the same story. Retail sales were continuing to rise significantly until COVID-19. Huge drop off, huge drop, 39% drop in retail sales to where by August 2023, we have the strongest retail sales we've ever had in our history. And then lastly, gross domestic product also sort of tells the tale to where, you know, we actually do go into a fairly deep recession. But again, we come out of it relatively quickly. And again, that's really kind of in contrast to what happened with the Great Recession. It took a very long time to get back to where we were. And in this case, the recovery has been fast and the recovery has been sustained. Where we have a little bit of a mixed message is the Standard & Poor's 500 index. Again, it has a steady rise right until COVID-19 takes a steep dive. In fact, it goes from its pre-COVID-19 peak of 3380 and it drops down to 2305. It's recovered past that. It's hit a peak of about 4,700. It's had some mixed results since then, but it's still almost 30% higher today than its pre-COVID-19 peak. So where does that mean we're headed? Well, many economists believe that we're going to see continued strengthening of the economy. There really wasn't anything out there before COVID-19 to give us concerns about a faltering economy. And now that we seem to have recovered from that, it looks like the pandemic is over. Continuing spouts of people getting variations of COVID-19, but the mass pandemic appears to be over. And the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, I believe highly credible organization, they see nominal growth rates over the next 3 years of somewhere around 4%. Or as the California economic forecast said, the long-awaited recession is postponed and perhaps canceled. So what's the impact on the city's finances? The city's top three revenues, property tax, sales tax, utility users tax, they're almost 80% of the total. And those revenues are going to be driven by what's happening in the economy and how that affects California, how that affects Southern California, and how that affects South Pasadena. Because at the end of the day, your revenues really can't be at any one point in time significantly better than the strength of Southern California and the strength of California. State budget situation. Over the past 35 years, the greatest threat to cities, I believe, wasn't dot-com meltdowns, wasn't the Great Recession, wasn't housing meltdowns, wasn't corporate scandals, wasn't COVID-19. It was the state of California, because they would take money away from local governments, even as local governments were experiencing the same type of fiscal difficulty that the state was. So historically, the state of California, one of our biggest threats. This last budget go around, after having experienced probably 2 or 3 of their best finance years in many years in California, they were facing a $27 billion gap. Surprisingly enough to me, they solved and resolved that $27 billion gap using their own resources. They didn't look towards cities and local government as a partner, in doing that. So there weren't any state takeaways, quite frankly, on the horizon. On the other hand, as the state of California went through a number of good years, there wasn't any discussion about restoring any of those either. So for right now, the state of California is not an immediate threat. I don't see takeaways on the horizon. And there are some constitutional protections in place, but in my experience, 5 years is a long time for the state of California to leave cities alone. So your current financial condition, this is your unrestricted fund balance over the last 10 years. Very, very strong, with an even stronger uptick in 21-22. Yes.
I wanted to ask clarification on this item. So you use the term unrestricted for this chart, but on the next page, you talk about unassigned balance. So I'm a little bit confused which one that you're talking about. So on page 7, you go into the general fund balance is 22 million. Is that unrestricted? Or because, and I guess because look, there's a $6 million difference that goes from 2020 to 2021. And I'm concerned that that's the SLURF funds.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't catch that. Hey, John, maybe you can be my simultaneous translator here.
Sheila, let me see if I can.
I'm
help.
sorry, if you could stand here and just sort of paraphrase what she asked me.
So what I was asking is on page 6, the term is unrestricted. And then on page 7, we talk about an unassigned balance. So I'm just trying to reconcile if you're talking about unrestricted as the total general fund balance, or are you talking about the unassigned balance? And I asked that because there's a $6 million shift that happens between 2020 and 2021. And I wanted to find out if that was actually related to the SLURF funds. So that would be a
John, do you need the
clarification on the
report?
chart.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me talk about the different categories. There are basically 3 categories of fund balance in generally accepted accounting principles. The first one is non-spendable. This means it's not really in a form that can pay salaries. And that's typically like prepaid insurance, any prepaid expenses, inventory, things that are really not in a form where appropriations can be funded. So that's non-spendable.
Bill, I understand that. I'm actually
The
just trying
second
to- I'm trying-
category-
I'm trying to understand your terminology, because on one page you use the term unrestricted, on the other page you use unassigned. So I'm just trying to understand, there's a $6 million shift between 2020 and 2021. So I want to see, is that because it included the $6 million in SLURF funds? And if so, that actually it's just something that needs to be adjusted. That's all.
But let me just walk through this a little bit so we're clear about what unrestricted means. The second category is it's restricted by an outside agency. The city does not have discretion over how to use those funds. Everything else, if it's spendable and it's unrestricted, then that's an unrestricted balance. Within an unrestricted balance, you could have commitments, you could have assignments and unassignments. But the reality is anything that's a commitment or an assignment, that's a policy determination by the council. Anything that is unrestricted could be used for appropriation purposes. And that's why when you're trying to get a sense from year to year of what is the available fund balance to fund appropriations, the unrestricted balance is really the best thing to look at, because from year to year, what might be committed or what might be assigned can change from year to year. But even at that, whatever the commitments are, whatever the assignments are, those are subject to council determination. They could commit funds one year, uncommit them the next. Those are policy determinations. So if you really want to take a look at what discretionary fund balance does the city have, then you want to look at the unrestricted fund balance.
So Bill, the question still remains. There's a delta of approximately $6 million between 2020 and 2021 that you're showing on your chart. What is the source of that $6 million delta?
What's the question?
The question is, they want to know what's the reason for the change in fund balance from fiscal year 20 to 21.
Yeah.
And that more than likely is for fund. I don't have the information in front of me, but more than that is.
And that was your question.
That was my question. And look, while I appreciate the lesson there, one of the jobs of the Finance Commission is to make sure that documentation is presented in a manner that is easy to understand by the general public, not just people with governmental accounting backgrounds. And so what I'm asking for is making sure that the language is easy to follow between the two. So, if you have a chart, table 11, that says unrestricted general fund balance, and then you go to the table 12 and you say total general fund balance, are you talking about the same thing? And I'm just trying to follow that. That is it. So are we talking that it jumped up to 24 or near 24 million and now it's at 22 million? Or are you saying that we're talking about the unassigned of 18? Like that's it. So it just needs to be simple and to the point, and so that we can follow along. Because if it is the SLRF monies, I think one thing that we know is, it skews it, especially if there isn't a note in here that says, this increase was as a result of the $6 billion in SLRF. And which actually, we've seen in further communications that being a consistent issue, because then it makes the fund look, the revenues and expenditures look off. So that's all I'm saying. And I'm also curious why it went to 2020, 22, not 23, since we have most of the actuals for that.
And
Well,
John, as I remember on the SLRF funds, that they weren't actually spent. I think they're still sitting somewhere. They haven't yet been, or it's not, the cash hasn't been outflow, but
But they're not in the general fund as of right now, or where is? But much of that has been appropriated, hasn't it? But much of those funds have been appropriated? Okay, so they've already been appropriated to be spent. And then, yes.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So we had to move it out of the general fund because any federal funds that we receive, they need to be in their own fund so that we could track it for reporting purposes.
Right. And so look, from a reporting standpoint, it looks like, wow, suddenly the city did this amazing, great job. And without it noting in here and actually ultimately makes you look bad in future years if it goes down, which, it will. So it's like, well, we've got this huge trend, but that's not a true trend. And I think that's what I have an issue with. This is an unusual blip without having a notation stating that this, increase is not a trend. It was a one time. Right.
Right. And you're attempting to correct that, John, now by setting up that separate fund.
If I could
Yeah.
do one response, the simplest answer for why fund balance rose, of course, is you brought in more revenues than you had expenditures. But why? I think there are two factors happening here. One is you were starting, and you'll see this in some of these other charts. You're starting to recover your revenues from those pre-COVID, from
No,
COVID-19.
No, I'm sorry. That's not true. That is actually.
I
fa-
think
that-
you're going
that
to
is-
see
that
some
is-
top
that is-
revenues
but
where
no,
you start to
that is
recover.
actually factually incorrect. That $6 million difference was money given to us by the government for COVID recovery. It was SLRP. It's a $6 million one-time revenue. It is not a trend. That is actually, that assumption right there is factually incorrect.
Okay.
And by the way, the money has already been appropriated and moved out of the general fund. So
in
that is,
23.
yes, it was already moved out and it's already been appropriated for expenses.
Yeah, so. So just to address that, Commissioner Rossi. So in the fiscal year 23-24 budget, I've actually moving that money out of the general fund over to its own fund and including with that, the related appropriations for that. So I don't want to kind of obfuscate it. So there's two parts to it. So originally in the general fund, there was a $6 million of revenue, but there were also appropriations. They weren't quite $6 million. They were like $5.8 million, something like that. But nonetheless, those are so the 6 million was being offset by those appropriations, except for that whatever couple $100,000 difference. We've moved both of those out of the general fund, so it's kind of a neutral kind of condition, if you will. But to your point, yes, it increased that because of that one-time cost.
Right. So I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So, and look, part of it is the way that this chart was chosen, the time period that was selected to exclude 2023
Mhm.
makes this look like a trend versus if you brought in 2023, you would show that which, we've completed the 2023 fiscal year.
Yeah.
If you brought in 2023 into this chart, you would show it dip back down because that money has already been removed out of the general fund.
Right.
And so that changes the trend analysis.
Yes.
Right.
So-
Yeah.
That is correct.
Yeah.
And Bill, I might recommend that as you're preparing for the city council presentation, that you amend your chart here and offer some explanation about the SLR funds that's the reason for the jump. And then John, it may be helpful if
The subsequent adjustment into
yes,
its
sir.
own fund.
If you
Yeah,
add a
absolutely.
bar for 2023
Yeah.
and demonstrate the subsequent adjustment, to Commissioner Rossi's point,
Yes.
it makes it much clearer and much more understandable and digestible by folks outside of this room.
Absolutely. So I apologize for that, but that is, you're correct.
So Bill, sorry we got you off track there, but again, this, I understand your concern and I understand why this needs to be adjusted or amended. Okay, good job. Now, Bill, do you know how we want you to do this? Are you clear on how we want?
Yeah, I'll work with it.
Thanks, John.
So they're asking for within this chart to show 23 because they've moved the
Yeah.
SLRF money out of the general fund
Yeah.
over to its own fund.
Let me tell you the reason that these go to 22, because in putting these charts together, I didn't want to use estimates. I didn't want to use unaudited numbers. 22
Fair.
is the last audited numbers that are available.
Fair.
And I wanted to use numbers that hopefully would have a high level of credibility
Right.
and acceptance. So that's why these all go through 22.
Right.
It's the last complete audited year.
Yeah, and John, it may be helpful then to Commissioner Rossi's point, it may be helpful to show 23. If you want to identify it as projected, unaudited, whatever you want to do, but just that's helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Bill. Well, sorry we got you off track there. Keep going.
We can get to this in just a minute, but if you're asking me why I believe your fund balance has increased so much in the last 2 years, clearly, when we look at revenues, you will see you had strong recovery from
That-
COVID-19.
That could be part
And
of
at
it.
the same token, I believe you tried to hold the line on costs. So that is, I think, the driver for this. But that's at a very high level. I'm not as confident about the expenditure side. When you take a look at your top revenues, you will see you had some very strong, sharp increases in 21 and 22 in your top revenues.
So Bill, you're saying, you're sticking to saying that $6 million increase is because of our strong revenues that weren't one time, but that our revenues are so strong. That is your assumption? That is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's what he said.
Sort of fast forwarding, since you're focused on kind of what's happening currently, this is the current projected 23-24 ending fund balance. You have a number of assignments and commitments, about 4.2 million in total, but you're projecting you'll end with about 22.7 million. So this basically means you have 18 million projected at the end of 23-24, 18 million in unassigned, uncommitted. So put that in perspective, that's about 47% of your revenues. And that compares to your target minimum fund balance of 30%. After you kind of take away the 30%, you still have about, what that means is you have about 6.6 million in unassigned fund balance above your target. Let me just touch briefly on that 30% fund balance target. The GFOA recommends a minimum of 16%, basically a minimum of 2 months. They have a structured approach for trying to assess what is a reasonable fund balance for an agency that basically ranges somewhere between 16% and 35%.
Mhm.
In their model, it doesn't mean there couldn't be rationale for a target more than 35. But that puts your 30% target clearly in the mainstream and at kind of the high end of that mainstream. Without having done any particular risk analysis of what is the best fund balance for you or a reasonable target, 30% compared to many other cities in the state of California is a pretty reasonable target for your minimum.
Thank you. Bill, before you move forward, go back to the last slide. Small thing. It says June 30, 2034. It should be 24.
Down below, it says 20, yeah.
Okay, so small thing.
Yeah, it's your projected ending fund balance at June 30, 2024.
24.
24. Like
It's a typo.
10 months from now.
No, okay, I'm sorry. Thanks, appreciate it. Small thing. So
Again, after about 4.2 million in assignments, you have 47% of your revenues compared with your target of 30. Again, that's 6.6 million above your target minimum. And this provides you some flexibility to do one-time things. You don't want to fund ongoing operations with any of that fund balance that might be above your target, but you could certainly do one-time things with it. There's one-time important studies you want to do, general plan amendment, if there's a circulation element update, if there's important capital projects that you want to get done, that would be a reasonable use of your fund balance. Now, this is a heresy for many finance directors, but cities actually don't exist to have large fund balances. You have resources in order to do cool things for your community. You need to have reasonable reserves to give yourself protection against reasonable risks. But above that target, to the degree that you're using that one time, because you can only use reserves once, if there are important things to accomplish for the community on a one-time basis, it makes sense to use those strong fund balances. So the question that's been asked is, does the city have a structurally balanced budget? The answer is, it depends upon how you define that. Some people might define a balanced budget where total revenues are equal to or greater than total expenditures. There's some conceptual difficulties with that. Let's say you have a new playground, a new park that you want to renovate, and it's going to cost $5 million to do. And rather than either borrowing the money or using all of your reserves in 1 year, you decide to set aside $1 million every year for 5 years in order to pay cash for those improvements and do it on kind of a pay-as-you-go basis or a layaway basis. Well, the problem with that is when you get to year 5, if total expenditures can never exceed total revenues, you'll never be able to do that park. Because all other things being equal, you'll spend $5 million more than you brought in that year. So most balanced budget policies are really focused on operations. We want operating revenues to be in balance or better than operating revenues to be better than operating expenditures. One-time costs like park improvements, those are things where it's a legitimate use of fund balance as long as you're kind of keeping your target fund balance at the minimum level. And that's exactly how the city's balanced budget policy is structured. The city strives to maintain a balanced operating budget. Emphasis is mine. The city strives to maintain a balanced operating budget for all governmental funds, and that's the general fund is a governmental fund, with total ongoing revenues equal to or greater than total ongoing expenditures. And it goes on to say ongoing operations are funded by recurring revenues.
We have a question, Bill. Yes.
The policy states for all governmental funds. The general fund is a governmental fund type, but that does not mean it excludes other governmental funds, such as the insurance fund, which is an internal service fund. Would you like me to repeat that again? The policy states for all governmental funds. The general fund is a governmental fund, but that does not mean it excludes the other funds. So I understand that the general fund is a governmental fund, but I just want to make it clear that when you're talking about this, what the policy is actually saying is for all of the funds.
In this context, because the scope of my work is the general fund, I'm looking at how this definition and how revenues and expenditures play out for the general fund.
Yes, however, there are funds such as the insurance fund, which are funded by the general fund. And ultimately, the liabilities in the special revenue funds are the liability of the general fund. You cannot go ahead and take those two things apart. When those special revenue funds, when they're liabilities, the bill comes due to the general fund, that you cannot separate those.
John, please.
So
I was asking Mr. Statler. Like that is, how can you separate those? You're the expert on this. I would like to
You know,
understand.
I can only respond in the context of the work that I was assigned to do, which is to be focused on the general fund, not the water fund, not the sewer fund, not the gas tax fund, not the SP1 fund, and any other special revenue funds you may have. There are two funds, the Business Improvement Fund and the Lighting Landscape, are included in my analysis because you make direct contributions to those funds. You're subsidizing them. The insurance fund is included because, again, how the insurance fund is funded affects the general fund and affects water, sewer, and golf as well. So,
And the insurance fund
so
is an
in
operating
this
fund.
context of defining, and I would basically say this definition is applicable to any of the special revenue funds that you have. But again, it would be focused on operations. Most of your special revenue funds, not all of them, but most of your special revenue funds are not operationally oriented. They're capital oriented, which would mean you really don't even, you don't have a similar structure for evaluating what's a balanced budget.
However, the insurance fund in particular, as well as the landscaping fund, are operating funds.
Yeah,
Yes or no?
actually, the insurance fund is not a governmental fund. It's a proprietary type fund. It's an internal service fund, uses a different basis of account counting. And you know, I'm going to talk about the insurance fund a little bit. Maybe we can
Okay.
talk about the insurance fund when we get there.
John, anything to add, John?
So one of the things I just want to point out for
Please
this,
turn your mic.
oh, I'm sorry. So one of the things I just want to kind of point out is specific to special revenue funds. Quite often you will have special revenue funds that have, they can have deficit balances, they can have oddball balances, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So they're generally not considered within the general fund or operations. And I'll give you an example of that. So we have a fund, and if you were to look at our 22-23 projected fund balances summary, along with our 23-24 fund balance summaries, you will see there's funds in there with deficit balances in there. And so sometimes there's a lot of reasons why that is. Sometimes it's due to timing of billing and so forth like that. We have, for example, we have one particular fund in there. It's referred to as the BTA fund. If you look at our budget document, it shows a $416,000 deficit balance that within the budget document. We just received revenue related to that fund about a week or two ago, where it's basically going to wipe out that deficit condition. It'll have, I don't know, something like $20,000 positive balance or whatever. But my point in bringing it up is on some of the special revenue funds, you may have timing differences on there, but there are also, as I pointed out in prior commission meetings and council meetings, we also have to do accounting cleanup, on some of this. And our poster child is always going to be our Prop C funds.
I understand that. I guess my point is you cannot have an analysis of the general fund that excludes the liabilities, because ultimately those credit cards get paid by the
Sure.
general fund.
Yeah, sure.
So if those funds don't come in, that's how it happens. And that includes the insurance fund. And I'm not really appreciating this trying to parse out the words. And even in this particular document, they're saying the general fund is a governmental fund type. Okay, if you want to be like that, then go ahead and let's list out the other governmental fund type, because I'm hearing this little argument coming through. And I'm a little bit surprised also that someone who's a financial expert in governmental accounting is saying they can only talk about this specific item and they can't actually answer a question that I'm asking. And these are based on the assumptions, right? So we're supposed to take these assumptions that he's providing and use them for the basis of our projections that we have confidence in. I'm not getting confidence just in this few minutes that we've been having this discussion. So
Sure.
that's what
Okay.
I just wanted that to be clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. John, anything else to say?
So one of the things I just wanted to mention, which is an important point. So Bill will be bringing up the insurance fund, because even though it's not a quote governmental fund, it's still kind of an integral part of our operations on there. So to your point, absolutely, it's part of the operations, but it is kind of a separate segment. And that's why we're kind of making that distinction.
Yep.
Nothing more than that.
Well, and John, I am so tired of hearing about the insurance fund. We need to put this to bed, okay, really soon. Because if we're going to speak with credibility to our city council, we have to have the information and the plan
Yes.
to bring that into balance.
And that will be, Mr. Statler will be addressing that as
Perfect.
well.
So, yes.
Chair, if I may, I know that, John, at the meeting right after the budget,
Mhm.
we had a really great meeting here
Mhm.
about every fund
Yes,
and where it stood. And you really gave a great analysis of, some of those funds were negative and here's why. And we were following up to
Yes.
try to
Yes.
get grant funding. And I'm just wondering, unless I missed it, boy, it'd be really great to have that kind of analysis again.
yes.
So that we can understand what progress or not has
Yeah.
been made.
Sure. Completely agree. The reason what I'm waiting for right now is we're really trying to wrap up the year end and like finalize numbers. And so I don't want to go through a bunch of iterations as the numbers change. And so what I'm looking for, and so for our November 1st, what I would like to do is some really almost draft year-end numbers for all of the funds within that, so that you guys do have that context. 'Cause I
And
totally
if I-
understand that point.
And John, if I remember correctly, you agreed to do that with the understanding that year end was consuming a lot of your attention. And
Yes.
then I think, Janet, he did say it was going to be October, November before he was able to
Yeah,
get back to us.
that's fine. I'm
Perfect.
just looking forward to that.
Yeah.
And John, while we're talking about this, I cannot remember where I saw it, but I thought I saw some references to timing to the council on sort of budget documents and that kind of thing. And I'm only just saying, when those kinds of things come to the council, can you make sure that that is consistent with what I think this commission came up with a really great calendar
Mhm.
for when budgets were coming to, and when draft financial statements were coming. And I apologize. I can't remember where I saw it, but I was like, I don't think that's consistent with what's going to finance. So I think we just need to, and that's early next year.
Yes.
I'm just giving you a little heads up because I just want to make sure that we're on the same page.
Good call out, Jen.
No,
Very
no,
good.
absolutely. And I'm happy to go back and revisit that
Right.
and make certain that we are in sync with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, John. I remember that was a difficult process to get to agreement on that. So hopefully you can dig that out and we can
Yes.
sync that up with what Jen is talking about with the city council.
No, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. So Bill, excuse us, we continue to ask questions
Well,
and take you off track a bit. So what I'd like you to do is get you back on track at this point, and do remember that the questions were asked, and I think appropriately so.
don't go. What's he asking?
What's he asking? He's asking you to get back on track and get started.
Just go ahead and continue on.
Continue.
where you left off on the presentation.
Do you mind?
Go ahead, continue on. where you
Oh,
left
okay.
off.
Thank you.
Huh?
I don't, there's a lot of me that wants to move on, but I want to be sure that we're clear on this notion. This is really a best practice. This is mainstream of other cities. And that is, when you look at the question or ask the question, do you have a balanced budget? Really, the focus is typically on operations, because you can have lots of capital programs that aren't part of your ongoing base. You could have significant one-time costs that aren't part of your ongoing base.
Right.
You could have one-time revenues that aren't part of your ongoing base. But this structure of whether you have a balanced budget, at least in the general fund, is, how do recurring revenues match up against recurring costs?
Bill, thank you. And we heard you, and we're going to hold our own counsel on that one. Thank you.
Implicit in that notion is that it's okay to use beginning fund balance. It's okay to use beginning reserves, as long as they're used to fund one-time things that won't recur, or as long as they're used to fund capital projects that won't recur. It's not explicitly stated. Some fund balance policies do explicitly state, yes, we can use beginning fund balance, can use reserves, as long as it's for one time, as long as it's for capital projects or other one-time purposes. So here's a surface analysis. This statement is actually fairly simple, but undoubtedly it maybe has some controversy associated. But if you go to the page of your budget that has the changes in fund balance, 23, 24, you'll see that revenues backed up by all of the detailed revenues are 39.6 million. And all of those are really continuing revenues. There aren't any significant one-time revenues in that number. And when you look at total expenditures, it's 39.1 million. So if you ask me, at least on this surface look, is the budget balance in the general fund? Yeah, it has $500,000 in revenues more than expenditures. Now, that's just on the surface. We should probably take a look at that a little more to sort of examine what one-time savings do we maybe have, what one-time costs do we have, what other sort of one-time obligations do we have. But really, just on its very surface level, there's $500,000 more in revenues coming in 23, 24 than there are expenditures. That said, maybe we should take a deeper look, because we want to take a look at transfers out. You have 1.4 million in transfers out that are going to your capital improvement fund. Those are for all capital projects. Those would really, by almost any definition, not be operating. Those are capital. Those are one-time costs. So that's 1.4. On the other hand, there is 852,000 in transfers out to the lighting and landscape maintenance fund and to the downtown fund. Even though these aren't technically expenditures, they're transfers. The city's total picture doesn't change because you transfer money from one fund to another. The total remains the same. But nonetheless, there's $852,000 less in the general fund because of these transfers. And they've historically been made. And unless there was some particular plan to change this to me becomes kind of part of your operating cost base. Deeper look, prorated vacancies. At the time the 23-24 budget was put together, out of 135 general fund positions, 34 of them were vacant. That's a 25% vacancy factor. That's pretty unusual. Probably a target that would be quote reasonable in reasonable times might be somewhere around 5%. You're never going to have all positions filled all the time, but 25 is pretty high. And in order to really account for the fact that those 34 positions were not going to be filled come July 1st for a full year, they were, can I finish this thought?
Yeah.
No? Okay.
Yes, finish.
Okay. They were prorated. Some were assumed to be filled for 12 months, all the way to some positions were only assumed to be filled for 4 months. So taking a look at what they reasonably felt could get filled over a year period of time, that meant that they prorated. There were $1.1 million worth of costs that got prorated in that. That when you look at that on an annual basis, once those vacancies are filled, that's 1.1 million on an ongoing baseline basis that should be added back in, because that's just a one-time savings given the significant vacancies.
Thank you.
I just have a quick question, memory-wise. How many new positions were authorized in the 23-24 budget?
5.
5.
5, okay.
And then there were 3 temporary positions.
There were 3 reclasses. So originally,
Three.
the original proposal was to add 9 new positions and I want to say 5 reclassifications. And the final determination was 5 new positions and 3 reclassifications.
Yes.
Even if you adjust for the 5 positions, which of course you would never expect to be filled July 1 if they're brand new positions, unless you had an eligibility list, I suppose maybe it could be filled. But even if you adjust for that, it's still a 20% vacancy factor. So the important point I'm trying to make here isn't whether it's good, bad, or indifferent to have 34 vacancies, only that the budget prorated for those vacancies by about $1.1 million. On an ongoing basis, really need to add that $1.1 million back in.
That's fair.
Deeper look at insurance. The current 23-24 budget in the insurance fund, all funds combined, is about 3.9 million. In looking at past trends, that looks reasonable to me. There's been years in the past where it was up by where it was only up by 2 million. There were years when it was up by 4. But when you look at the past years where you've accounted for the insurance fund in this way, it averages about 3.4. So with this at 3.9, this is a 15% increase over what it has averaged over the last years. That appears to be reasonable to me, especially since you've had some time for the insurance fund to sort of develop. That doesn't do anything to address the long-term liabilities of about 2.7 million. It just means going forward, it looks like you're setting aside about the right amount of money. So that's 2.7 is what the current estimate is as for your long-term liabilities. The general fund share of that, however, is 58%. Other funds, water, sewer, and golf constitute the other 42. That 58% apportionment is kind of been a long-standing basis of apportionment of insurance costs. So that does mean that out of the 2.7, 1.56 million of that is the general fund's responsibility. Do want to point out, and this kind of surfaced in another way, in addition to the governmental funds, you have one other main type of fund group in generally accepted accounting principles, and that's proprietary funds. And the difference is they're accounted for on a different basis of accounting. They're accounted for on a full accrual basis as if they were private sector companies. And the 2 types of proprietary funds are internal service funds and enterprise funds. So they are measured in a different way. In the governmental funds, really the focus there is on current assets and current liabilities. And the GFOA best practice on this for enterprise funds, proprietary funds, is when you look at it from a budgetary perspective, to take the same focus, to look at working capital, current assets minus current liabilities. when you look at it from that perspective, the fund is covering its current liabilities and its current assets. That's a short-term viewpoint. The fact of the matter is this is accounted for in an enterprise on a proprietary fund basis. And in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, you should be recognizing, as you do, you should be recognizing all of those long-term obligations and setting rates for workers' comp and liability in accordance with those longer-term obligations. But just to put this in perspective, you went from an insurance JPA to your own insurance fund or self-retention in 2014. You didn't actually begin to recognize in your audits, I'm not saying you shouldn't have, I'm just saying you didn't begin to recognize in your audits these long-term liabilities and long-term assets until 2020. So this kind of basis of accounting, relatively new, not brand new, but it's only about 4 years old for the city to apply. Having said that, as an internal service fund, you should strive to fund those long-term liabilities.
Bill, please.
So, yeah, so this is the area that is obviously, we're all tired of it, but but I have lots of questions for you. Because, you know, you have in here the insurance fund balance of 2.7 million. So what I'm actually looking at is a 2024 ending balance that's a negative $1.8 million, not 2.7. The 2.7 was what the actuarials used for their projected liabilities for workers' comp and GL, short-term and long-term. But if we actually take a look at things for a moment here, what happened in their things is that's not what that's not what the auditors presented. They said that we have the 70% because 70% takes into consideration that there's the long tail. But what we actually spent last year was 1.6 million net, when the actuaries had actually estimated only $854,000 short term in the 1 year. So we spent double what the actuary report said for 2022, 2023. So this idea that the majority of it is actually this long tail, it actually needs to, that needs to be squashed. We've looked over the numbers. We've seen what's happened. We know how much was spent. We know that the general fund, that the insurance fund had to borrow from the general fund to pay its bills. And then it went back to being negative. Right. So I've heard this over and over again. The majority of this is long-term, it's long-term. But when you actually look at the actuarial reports, and they said total projected short-term of workers' comp and GL, $854,000 last year. Our total net after reimbursements was double that. And part of the reason I think the actuaries were wrong, because they were confused when I said that, was that they were looking at the actuarial reports for the third-party administrator, not what we actually had to pay, because there were items that went outside of the insurance, right? That Carl Warren didn't actually cover, correct? So, I mean, just something to consider. When we're talking, I've heard this over and over again, this saying that, oh, this is all long-term, this is long-term. Period. So the other thing I want to say, because this is, you know, it's not in this presentation, but it's in the presentation that we're reading. There is a statement here that says that the staff has proposed funding this negative balance over 10 years for an annual general fund cost of $155,000. And that's one of the key assumptions that you're using in this. So this, and then you said the city's auditor and actuary concur with this approach. First of all, the actuary had nothing to do with, they made no statement whatsoever about what to do with the insurance fund. That's not their position as the actuary. The city's auditor said it could be either paid in a lump sum or over a course of 2 to 3 years. And that was something that the commission was actually supposed to come back this month for discussion and a recommendation, and it was left off of the agenda. So I have a problem with having that put into the report prior to us having had an opportunity to discuss that. A big question that I have with our giant healthy reserves, why not pay it? Why not pay it? If our reserves are so abundant, why not pay the negative balance and bring it up? The auditor said that it has to be paid. Why do a 10-year thing? We're going to have problems next year again, so why not pay it now?
So
Generally accepted accounting principles do say you should have that 2.7 million in the bank. And I'm not trying to negate that in any way, shape, or form because of the way you've chosen to account for it. There could be different ways of accounting, but you've chosen an internal service fund, which means you need to recognize that long-term obligation. But keep in mind, these long-term obligations are going to be paid out over a very long period of time. You could take that 2.7 million because you have it available in general fund balance and put it in the insurance fund. I mean, if you know, that would be a policy decision that the council could make. But that 2.7 million will be tied up for 10, 15, 20 years when you could do potentially other things with the money that might have more value. At the end of the day, do you need to put the 2.7 million there in total? Because of the way you account for this, that would be generally accepted accounting principles. On the other hand,
Excuse me.
similar to how you manage your other governmental funds, if you have working capital in that fund that is sufficient to have cash and receivables that can take care of your current term obligations, in the short term, that's going to serve you, that's going to serve you fine. And I haven't jumped to it yet, but that's one of the reasons why your actuary and your auditor are comfortable with the notion of allocating and amortizing that payment over time. Having said that, if any time at the end of the year, there is not adequate working capital, current assets are not adequate to take care of current liabilities, those funds you should move over immediately. If for whatever reason you're short because of claims, because of how you set your premiums, you really do need to, at a minimum, cover your working capital. At this point, I believe that's the likely outcome for 23, 24, but the dust of 22, 23, but the dust hasn't settled there yet.
Thank you, Bill, for that explanation. I don't think it answered the question. Could you, Sheila, could you help us with a question with as few words as humanly possible?
First, it is actually our financial policy to have it funded at 70%. The number is not actually 2.7 million. The number that we need to be looking at is bringing our fund balance to zero, because the actuarial data and what we're supposed to be holding brings that to zero. That's it. We don't actually need to go above and beyond the fund balance being at zero, but it needs to be at zero. And that means that we actually have to pay what we haven't been paying. Those are ongoing expenditures. Second is that the actuaries, as I said, never concurred with this idea of having it over 10 years, and neither did the city auditors. It's just not factually incorrect to have that in there. And I have a problem with having it in there. But the bigger thing is you talk about it could be used.
Sure, can you
Okay.
stop for 1 second?
Yes.
John, can you verify whether or not the auditors and or actuaries concurred?
They did concur. I've had extensive conversations with both the auditors and the actuaries about the approach. But one of the things I do want to address is, the question of why not fund it? We have these general fund balances, dollar amounts. Why don't we just fund this? And the number one reason, just being very conservative with this, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the timing of when these obligations will come due. There's also the question of recovery of insurance monies from this. So as I mentioned in prior meetings, we're doing a deep dive on a whole lot of things. And when I was starting the budget development back in March and April, one of the things I started looking at, is all the payments that we were making to Carl Warren and Intercare. And one of the things that kind of jumped out during that was the process of recovering, because I'm saying, as you've seen as well, we're paying out a lot of money for that. And so we started doing deep dives on that. And right now, from a math formula only, so I want to be very clear about what I say here. So from a math perspective, we have potentially $2.5 million to recover for the insurance fund. Now, I say that again from a mathematical standpoint. In other words, costs above the SIR, the insurance companies reimburse us for. Now, the caveat with that, when I say mathematical, is because we're dealing with the insurance. We don't know exactly what we're going to recover of that $2.5 million, let alone the timing of when we're going to get that. the reason why I'm bringing this up right now is because of those types of uncertainties. I'm always reluctant to commit that kind of money to the insurance fund. And that's my reason for it. Fundamentally.
While I appreciate your reluctance, we do have a policy in place, and the policy in
Sure.
place is stated for a very particular reason to ensure that we have the funds available to pay the claims.
Yes.
Period. And in the past few years, the claims have gone up significantly.
Yes.
And many of them were not actually covered by the insurance. So that is a period. So while I appreciate the reluctance to do so, if they get reimbursed, but that's awesome.
Yes.
We're not saying the insurance fund keeps all that money. It just, we keep it at a zero place.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, by being self-insured, we need to guarantee that we have the money to cover the claims that come in. It can't be a surprise to the general fund balance. And that's one of the issues. It can't be this surprise that comes in and to say we used it for other things and we decided that we wanted to use it for one-time expenditures and capital. And all of a sudden the insurance claims come in and we don't have the money because we didn't set it aside. So while I understand that that is a policy decision,
Mhm.
and I don't understand the argument to go ahead and forego that policy.
So the general fund has reserves and they have fund balance that is more than sufficient to cover the liability.
That
So
is not, that is
so
not the policy.
the
No, we've
policy-
had this argument over and over again. The policy is clear. The insurance fund is supposed to put the reserves. So if you want to say the general fund, okay, then earmark it someplace else. However you want to say it, the money needs to be put aside. And I'm tired, and like, I feel like is that Bill's been here to repeat everything that you've already told us. And then I was in the room when the auditors spoke. I was in the room when the actuary spoke. And you're saying that they said something different to you. I wanted it in writing. Because quite honestly, I'm kind of tired of this. I'm tired of this back and forth. We go back to the same place. I can show you the analysis. I can show you the financials. What you're saying is just categorically not true.
It is
So-
true.
Period.
Okay.
There's
so
no
we-
question about it. And I'm not going to get into an argument about it.
We're
It
not
is-
asking. for
It
an
is true. And I'm happy to provide a statement from them. But respectfully, this commission is not here to be a forensic audit of the day-to-day operations. It's here really for policies for this. We're getting into the weeds on these things. So I understand you want to, that's fine.
No. It's the commission is here for oversight. And it is
It
here
is
to
for
give right- it
oversight
is
of
here-
policy.
It is here for oversight of policy. This is a violation of the policy. So
I don't agree with
you
you
have
with
to get
that.
into the.
I don't agree with you at all. I think the general fund does have the money there. And it
That's not
does
what the-
cover it.
That's not what the
And
policy
please let me
states.
finish this one sentence. The policy also states, not the fund balance, it talks about the liability, and the liability, the actuarial liability is $2.7 million, as Mr. Statler has pointed out.
Correct.
So if you're talking about the insurance policy, it's 70% of the liability, not the fund balance. On there, the general fund does cover that. We have fund balance to cover that more than the 70% on there. So we are not out of compliance.
And John, let me just state for the record that so far we've only seen the 2022, 2023 actuaries. We didn't see the projections because you didn't actually provide that to us. You omitted that from the report that you provided. So the files that we saw
Yeah.
only showed 2022, 2023. It didn't show the forecast for this next year. That is what you should use for the budget.
So the actuaries,
You didn't provide the entire report. You
they're,
only
the
provided some
actuaries,
pieces.
how do I want to say this? They've calculated what the liability is as of June 30 of 23. That's what the actuarial reports reflect. And in those reports, the total actuarial liability for general liability and workers' comp is approximately $2.7 million. That's what the actuarial reports. You know, I did offer to send the entire report. Remember, I made the comment, you know, the actuarial report is, it's like 40, 50 pages. It's a fairly lengthy report. I'm happy to forward it on, you know, to you on there. But the liability that they are projecting is as of June. So they're projecting it as of June 30, 23. They're not projecting forward. They're saying as of June 30, 23, this is what we're estimating the actuarial liability is. And they break it down between short-term and long-term, between workers' comp and general liability. So they have done that. And what that means is the short term is, this is what we expect you to pay in the next 12 months. And this is what we expect you to pay in the months and years beyond that. So the JPIA invoice that we had to pay, the $1.6 million, we ended up paying just slightly under 1.5 because we got the discount. But my point is that payment is for things that are over 11 years old. So it finally came to fruition in there. So, and the only reason I'm bringing that up is
JPI.
how long these payments can draw out.
Exactly, but at the same time, it does come due one day. So
I'm
it's-
sorry, I'm sorry.
At the same time, it does come due, but when I was looking at my analysis, it didn't include the JPI. It was completely separate. And
Understood.
what I noticed was that, or what we actually paid out last year, net of reimbursements,
Yes,
was double what the actuaries had forecasted for with the 1 year short term. It just
Sure,
was
sure.
1.6 million over versus 854,000. So yes, reimbursements may also take years to come.
yes,
So as a self-insured fund,
yes,
we need to make sure that the money is there. And yes, there might be other uses like capital projects, but that's also the concern, right? Where we say, oh, well, it's not coming due, it's not coming due. We take it down and we're seeing significant one-time costs coming, right? So we
yes.
take it down and all of a sudden we're in trouble because the bill comes due. So
Yes.
look, our policy is written the way it is for a reason. It doesn't say keep it in the general fund. The auditors don't say keep it in the general fund. The auditors say you need to fund it. Even this idea of doing the 10-year amortization is a
Mhm.
way of saying you need to fund it.
Well,
Right.
so the whole point, the whole logic behind the 10-year amortization is twofold. One, it's being conservative, you know, and not impacting the general fund. So, so materially upfront. So that's one aspect of it. The other is simply because of the uncertainty of the timing of this, as well as the recoveries that will come in. So for example, you know, if we realize the entire 2.5, almost the entire liability and deficit condition of the insurance fund would be wiped out. But I don't want to accrue that because even the auditors are saying, well, yeah, you could probably accrue that because I'm being conservative with it.
Well, the policy doesn't state do the entire 2.7, it says 70%. And as you know, and as
Right.
you've stated, 60% of that comes from the general fund
Sure.
and the other 40% comes from
Can-
water and sewer.
Can I suggest maybe we segue
we-
to maybe
we can come
discussing
back.
some policy
No,
options?
No, I
here?
understand that, but it's one of we're happy to do so, but it is something that you put into your report and you chose to opine on. And I wanted to make sure that we had that discussion because I had issues with the way it was laid out.
And
John,
Understood.
let me rewind for a moment here.
Sure.
You made a commitment to provide written confirmation that the auditors and the actuaries do concur with this point of view.
Sure.
Perfect. And you'll do that for us?
Yes.
And you'll do it before November 1st.
Yes.
Thank you. What other commitments do you need, Sheila, to feel comfortable? I almost say good about moving forward, comfortable to move forward.
I think that actually, that serves it, but I think there's also a level of this notion that we're not supposed to get into the weeds to understand the oversight position, but okay, let me move forward. On,
Neither of us will ever
yeah.
avoid getting in the
Yes,
weeds, I assure
yes.
you. Okay.
yeah, I mean, I want to say that auditors, if you're saying the auditors will say this is the way to fund the insurance fund, and that's the way, what they are recommending, I'd like to see it in writing.
Okay,
Sure.
That's it.
And-
John,
but,
that'd be
but,
helpful.
so I'm going to do that, number one, but even set that aside for a minute. Ultimately, it's going to be the council decision.
Yes.
This is a policy decision. So my recommendation will be to amortize it over 10 years and adjust that payment schedule as we start realizing these recoveries from the insurance fund. And I'm doing that just from a cash flow and a conservative standpoint. But this is a policy decision and it will be brought to the council as well for
and-
discussions
and John,
at
just-
that point.
yeah.
And that's part of the year-end process.
And
And it
we
is-
understand that, John. One of the things, though, that we have developed a relationship with the council, where the council's going to look to us and say, what do you think about a finance commission?
Sure.
So you need to convince this group first so that we can help you convince the council what the most appropriate action would be.
Yes.
And Janet is our liaison, and I'm sure that there are days when she rues the day and she took that one on. But in the moment, okay, we're going to continue to get in the weeds. Now, John, one of the things that I do remember from our last meeting is Luis promised to do the analysis that you just talked about the recovery.
Yes.
When you can make that public, we would love to see that, the detail on that. But you did mention about 2.5 million in anticipated recovery.
Yes.
When that happens is a whole different point. To your point, it could be tomorrow, and it could be in 2026.
And we could get some surprises.
And well, and in addition to that, the 2.5 right now is just a mathematical result.
Yeah, we understand. Yeah.
So what we actually realize will be more than likely different than that. So that's another reason why I'm being conservative with
And
it.
John, I have to remind this chamber that you arrived in February,
Yes.
and you've been doing digging since February.
Yeah.
And
Well, and the budget. and
yeah,
everything
okay, and
else,
then the
yeah.
budget and all those other things.
Yeah.
I don't hold you accountable for what happens before you, but I do hold you accountable from February forward. Okay, so thank you. We really appreciate that. Janet, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Chair. Thank you. I just had a couple of thoughts. One is if we think this commission could, I think, put together a little task force or sort of a, 2-person task force, if you want to have sort of a powwow about insurance fund and policy and that might be nice if you want to take that on, or it's just a thought. And second, I do recall with the actuary, I think it was in this commission and not at the city council meeting, they were going to try to have their numbers earlier this year.
They committed to
That is correct.
Yes.
committed.
Okay. So that for the coming year, we'll have those numbers earlier.
Before the budget. He said he could have it as early as February, I believe. March,
Yeah,
February? Was it
I think it was March.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. March.
so once again, I just want to kind of criticality of the calendar that we've discussed in the past. And I think that's, anyway, just a thought to throw out if we wanted to put together a little 2-person or 3-person task force to kind of really just, kind of talk about the insurance fund.
Let's float that again at the end of the meeting and see what we can get someone. I'm sure we have at least one volunteer for that.
Mhm.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Bill, continue.
Okay, thank you.
Are you having
Um,
fun yet, Bill?
The staff's recommendation is to allocate that 1.56 million over a 10-year period of time. The auditors and the actuaries concur with that. That appears to be a reasonable solution. Having said that, it's a policy decision. You could pay all that 1.5 million today, but I want to stress that wouldn't make your budget out of balance from an operating perspective because it's a one-time cost. So at some point, if the council wants to address this in a one-time, you can do it. You have the general fund resources available, and you'll still have 5 million left over above your policy minimum. So it's really a question of what's the best policy for the city versus what's a reasonable assumption to make. And at least in terms of auditor and actuary concurrence, and given the fact that these are long-term payouts, you're not in any immediate danger of having to cash out the funds. This seems to me to be a reasonable solution. I think John may have already surfaced this. This actually came up at the August 24th meeting, that there were some concerns that there were legal costs that didn't get captured in your deductible. Management Services has done some exhaustive research, and they've come up with what they believe is $2.5 million worth of recoverables against your deductible claim. Now, I guess an important caveat here that it probably can't make big enough. How much you think they owe and when they should pay it may or may not bear any relationship to how much they think they owe, and whatever they owe, they'll pay. but it is significant. And this is not pie in the sky in the by and by. This is not blue sky. This is not wishful thinking. These, from my understanding of how the deductible should work, appear to me to be costs that are legitimately against your $100,000 deductible that Prism, your excess carrier, should reimburse you. How long that will take to play out, I don't know. I only know you have already made the claim. You've already submitted the request for reimbursement. And it appears to me that this is a very solid claim against that. Now, what my opinion is going to get you in terms of a nickel out of this is problematic. The key thing here, another rationale for not hastily transferring the money over, or at least maybe wait till mid-year budget review, see how this develops. Because if this in fact is recoverable and recoverable in the near term, that would really fully fund the insurance fund for virtually fund that going forward. If not, then it's always a policy decision that the council could make at the mid-year budget review. You can take a look at how did you actually end 22, 23, take a look at any other revisions you have. It would seem to me that the policy decision to potentially fund the entire insurance fund, that's a good mid-year, I think that's a good mid-year budget review item. The next item, taking a little bit deeper look, and that's one-time costs. Actually, there's a little over 1.5 million in one-time costs in the 23-24 budget. This is just a relatively sampling of those. But as I take a look at it, this looks to me like one-time things that you aren't likely to do again. If you update your cultural heritage ordinance, it looks to me like that's probably not in the near term to have to do it again. $400,000 to develop the tenant protection program. And just a handful of items that I listed here. This is over 70% of the one-time budgets that are there, and it's in your report.
So this is actually an area that I do have some questions on because there's some odd items that were included in one time. Some of these I can agree with because I understand the housing element has brought significant costs, although I would want to know what the projections are for future years related to housing elements and other things. So, no, I understand, but if we,
I
this,
only know,
wait, hold
I
on.
only know
I'm
this
not-
about those
please,
one-time costs as I look at them.
Hold on.
Those
please.
are all policy decisions the council made.
Bill, can I please finish?
Pardon?
Can I finish, please?
Yeah,
There are things in this is what you have in your presentation. The report is different. So there are a couple very specific points that I have, right? Hold on. There are line items that you have that look to me to be facilities maintenance and operations costs, or they're CapEx. Things like painting a room, which happens every year at the various facilities throughout town. Is that really a one-time cost? Or are you saying, well, we painted this one room this one time, next year we're going to paint another room? That's called facilities, operations, and maintenance. Another one you have run here, the electronic permit system. That is incorrect. The electronic permit system implementation is $151,000. The electronic permit system is in the CIP, the SIP, right?
Yeah.
For $125,000. So then it says, wait a second. So are you telling me that in the SIP, we are not including implementation? So we're only including the capital, we're not doing the entire capital project. There are going to be costs associated with every single capital project that we have. So it concerns me to see something like the electronic permit system implementation as a one-time cost. Why wasn't it included as part of the CIP? So and things like file server replacements. Okay, is that a capital project? That would be a one-time cost, or is it ongoing maintenance? So these are things that you're supposed to be providing those assumptions. Yes, I understand you're saying the policy decisions, but you are providing assumptions and like to make sure that you back up your assumptions.
you do have a maintenance budget. These are just the one-time items that were identified. If there is even more maintenance type items or infrastructure maintenance that you believe should be in the budget but aren't, that's kind of a different matter for me. I'm just saying, when we look at the baseline and we take a look at what your ongoing operation core is, these one-time costs are typically the types of things that we would back out.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean they aren't important. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't want to do more of these kinds of things in the future. But those would be one-time cost items that quite frankly would be reasonable to fund with your reserves with fund balance, because they're one-time things and using one-time money would be appropriate. Again, all I'm trying to do here is reconcile and ask yourself, what is your core base budget of the things we need to add in, like the fund subsidies, things that we need to add back in, like the prorated vacancies, but we also need to take a look at things that are in here that are not ongoing. And almost all of these are policy items. There's $2,000 worth of chairs at the War Memorial. Yeah, there's going to be chairs needed someplace every year. But these big dollar items, $1.5 million worth of items here, these are policy items that I'm sure the council discusses with this type of item in every budget item, because these are significant budget items that I wouldn't consider to be part of your operating base.
Right. Bill, we hear you loud and clear. I think what Commissioner Rossi and to some degree myself are thinking here is to include these as a significant portion of your presentation. You may be on thin ice. Some of these items are not in fact one-time items, that they could be, they're ongoing items. So John and you should get your head caucus on this and potentially have those items either call the list down or remove this slide completely, remove this from.
All I'm trying to walk through here is what are the significant one-time costs
Yeah.
that are not going to be repeated in next year's budget. There might be other things that get repeated or other things that get funded as one time.
Right.
Two things about that, if there are. One, that will be a policy discussion that the council will have to
understand.
have. But two, I would consider those to be one-time costs that if they were funded from reserves would be an appropriate cost to do so.
Thank you for bringing it up. I think you hear that we're not comfortable with that, and you may want to think about either removing this thinking or significantly reducing it.
So just to address this, so we do have, we did identify when we were doing the budget development, one-time costs, and there were $1.5 million. This is just an extract from that $1.5
Yes, it
million
is.
dollars
Mhm.
on there. So those are one-time things. The comment that we're always going to have to some degree, one-time things, absolutely true.
Okay.
But we're trying to show this in context.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, John. I appreciate it. And two things. I hear what you're saying. I understand Commissioner Rossi's concerns and the points she's making. You may want to frame this differently.
Mhm.
Okay, because again, you're looking for us to be able to say, City Council, we agree with this, or we agree basically the fundamental assumptions here. But this is obviously a lightning rod, and we need it to be addressed.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Absolutely.
it. Bill, thank you. Again, I understand. I do understand your logic. We just don't agree with it. We'll have to agree to disagree.
At a deeper look, the concept of expenditure savings, even if all the positions are, you got down to a modest 5% vacancy, there's some level of expenditure savings you can expect on an annual basis from the budget. There is a conception, or I would say misperception, that in government, departments spend every dime they have and they never save budget savings. In my experience, that's just not the case. There's almost always some budgetary savings. Typically, that may be somewhere between 3 to 4%. So in this case, I've used what I think is taking a look at your past expenditure savings, what I think is a very conservative estimate of 1%.
Okay.
So that's about 390,000. So just sort of wrapping this up, here's that deeper look. If we look at the operating budget as adopted, that's 39.1 million. If we add in the fund subsidies, that adds another 852,000. If we add back the prorated salaries, that adds about 1.1 million back. If we include the amortized insurance, that's an added cost of 150,000. But subtract from that the one-time cost, subtract from that estimated expenditure savings, we get awfully close to where we began. Now we have about 39.3 million and what I consider to be your core operating costs on an annualized basis. And that's about 300,000 less than the projected revenues. One interesting thing in terms of this analysis, if you did choose to actually fund all of that insurance shortfall with one-time funds, that would actually reduce the operating, that would actually reduce your operating costs because you wouldn't have this 150,000.
Right.
It'd actually bring your budget even closer to balance. Again, this is the difference between making an assumption versus a policy decision that the council might decide to make in terms of what's the best use of limited resources. But in either case, after I try and adjust for one-time costs, both up and down, 39.3. Again, revenues exceed costs by about 300,000. So from a general fund perspective, yes, the city has a balanced budget for 23-24. So from there, let's transition into revenue trends. And really your estimated revenues, 39.6 million in 23-24. And really your top three revenues, property tax is 50% of the total. And sales tax and utility users, it's close to 80%. In fact, if we take a look at your other taxes like business license tax, franchise fees, take a look at your permit and service charges, now we're down to only 5% being everything else. In the forecast itself, I'll go down to about the 95% level in terms of trying to develop models, but really the key ones to be focused on, the ones that really determine your fiscal outlook are those top three. So let's take a look at how those have done. This is 10 years of property taxes. Again, going through 22 because these are the last audited numbers that you have. And this kind of gets to why do I think you saw 21 and 22's fund balance rise? Because you had over that last 2 year period of time in property taxes, they were up by 15%. And that's your number one revenue source. That's 50% of the total.
Well, hold on one second. Let's move back. So one of the things I found interesting about your revenue trends, because you have information on the key revenue growth assumptions and you have the historicals, but what is missing is 23 and 24. So you have 20, so this current year and this last year that just completed are missing. And I understand that wanting to do audit, but he did projection key revenue growth assumptions that did not include last year and this year assumptions. So, and the reason I ask this is as I look through the property tax, you write in here, table 17, the city growth by 8% 2020, 2021, 7% by 21, 22. How much did it grow in 2022 and 2023? Do you know?
Do you know? Bill?
I'm not sure exactly what your point was there, but
So no,
maybe John has a response.
do you know
So,
the growth rate for it?
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head. I know the growth rate, I suspect is over 5%. I know for 23-24, it's 5.4%.
So in 2022-23 it was 3.5%. And in 23-24 budget, it was 6.3 was what you projected in it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the reason I ask is then you hop down into table 20, which has the 2020-24, and he has a property tax assumption of 4%. So what we put into this year's budget was 6.3%.
Mm-hmm.
And he is putting assumptions that seem fairly stable at 4% going forward. And it is strange to me that you answered my question about 2022 and 2023, saying that you, I guess it was, sorry, 2022, 23, 23, 24, saying that you don't know, because how do you do revenue projections if you don't know the current state? That is a simple question.
So let me respond to this for a minute. So in terms of all of our projections, both property tax, sales tax, we use a firm called HDL. They're the largest firm in the state, probably in the country, that provides this type of service. They do, they provide like forecasting for us. They also give us a tremendous amount of information. What are the highest property tax properties? What are the top 25 sales tax producers? That type of information. So we rely on them when we're doing our projections. So for example, when I built the budget for 23-24, I they have very in-depth analysis on their growth rates, on their, I've used them for probably 10, 15 years. They are generally hyper accurate. In there, I have absolute confidence in the projections.
Sure.
that they-
So how many years in advance does those projections go out to?
So, well, with the budget, I'm just obviously looking at 23, 24. They do go out several years, and I can provide that in there. And Bill probably has that as well. I
I thought that's what we hired Bill for, was to give
so-
us revenue projections.
so
That's what I'm
my
confused by.
point, my point is there may be other things that are included in that, but basic property tax for the 23, 24 year, that I do know it's 5.4%. So when we compare that to 22, 23, because Councilmember Braun brought this up when I was doing the budget development, and the question was like, well, God, this seems like we're really jumping in property tax from one year to the next. And the simple answer was when I dug into the analysis on it, and there was a big jump. It was simply because the 22, 23 revenue projections for that were understated.
Okay, so I mean,
So it
I had my
created this.
numbers
Yeah.
came off the last budget report that you did. And
Yeah.
those were then with the estimates that they came in. But in the budget still had a 6.3%. I do take issue with Mr. Sattler's, again, you're presenting this as though there is a growth rate of 8 and 7% and not taking into consideration what's actually happening in current years. Right. So I don't understand why there is this 2 missing years. They're kind of key missing years. And I don't understand how you do revenue projections without a sense of what's happening in current time. And I'm confused because I thought that he was being brought in for financial projections. And now you're telling me that we actually have financial projections from a different firm that are super accurate. And this is where I'm actually
Well,
just
these are, yeah,
really getting confused.
sure. So so Bill's doing the overall projection for the general fund because that's really our operating fund. And with respect to when I'm talking about HDL, that's the firm that we use for this consulting firm for our tax projections, basically. That is just a component of obviously all of our revenues. So there's other revenue sources in there as well. Obviously, I'm just going to kind of ramble for a minute in the sense that we have permits, we have charges for services, we have other revenue streams, if you will. So just in the context of property tax, sales tax, we use this firm that is specialized for this. And I'm sure, and I've given this information. And so these numbers are incorporated into Bill's long-range plans.
May I suggest we resolve this, at least a portion of this, pretty easily by expanding these graphs to include 23 and projection for 24.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And then label them as, whatever caveat you want to put in, just to show a more complete picture. Does that help, Sheila?
Yes, and then when we get to the table 19 with the UT, and one of the things is consistency in how you report numbers out. He was very clear in saying 2020, 2021, 2021, 2022. And then he goes into for the last 2 years, where he said, what does last 2 years mean? 6.1%, and said that it was very stable. But then when I looked into the actual numbers, it went from 8.5% in 2020-21 to 3.7% in the following year, and then to 4.8%. That's not stability. And so you're saying the 6.1%, he just averaged it out. And when I see things like that, I question what's going on. Why did you go to the effort to be very specific on the dates that you chose, on the numbers that you use, and where you chose not to get specific? And so just a note that I'd like to make on reporting.
Yeah, I do think that's been asked and answered when
you.
Bill was telling us that he was using only audited numbers.
Correct, but at the same time, he then goes on to provide projections and revenue growth assumptions.
Right.
And the reason this matters is that we just spent a considerable amount of time talking about how we do not have a structurally, we were structurally balanced because our expenditures were less than our revenues. But by looking at the numbers, and I'd love to see the new hits on them, but even using his growth assumptions, if we applied that to this current year's budget, our revenue projections dropped by $500,000. So we're not structurally balanced. I look back, and one of the things I said back during the budget season was that I was concerned that the revenue numbers were inflated, that they were higher than what was happening. And Bill's numbers actually support that because I'm looking at his 4% property tax. That's not what we used in our revenue assumptions. We used a 6.3% property tax assumption. So, he uses, and I was actually generous on the sales tax and made sure to use more like the 2.8% for it versus what we had actually used in our budget. And then the UUT tax. The UUT tax, I believe we had in here at the budget assumes 7.1% and Bill is using 4.5%. So it does matter because he spent a considerable amount of time explaining to us the assumptions for current year in the expenditures and then glosses over that for revenues. And I find that interesting is just how this report is being handled.
Okay,
And we can address that.
thank you. Thank you, John. Where are we now? We're still in property tax. So Bill, what we ask you to do is to expand this chart to include 23 with any caveats you need, unaudited numbers and projected 24. Okay.
We ready to move on?
I am, yes.
Sales tax revenues, however, let me just back up for 1 second. You'll see here really pretty constant, consistent rise in property taxes, but 2 significant jumps in 21 and 22. That is not the story for sales tax revenues. It hit its peak right pre-COVID-19, and it lost almost 40% of your revenues immediately after that. Kind of plateaued out for 3 years after that, but in the last 2 years, really pretty significant growth. 11% in 21 and 19% in 22. That said, of course, you haven't recovered from that pre-COVID-19 period, and I doubt in the 5-year forecast you will ever recover from this. Someday you will, but I think there's been enough changes in buying habits between internet sales, other big box stores that are outside your community. You'll continue to have some moderate growth in sales tax revenues, but it'll probably be outside this 5-year period and maybe longer before you get back to that pre-COVID-19 period. But again, the important thing is compared to what your base was in 20,
Right.
you did have significant growth in 21, significant growth in 22 from an admittedly reduced platform.
Bill, we have a question.
A question is, does the sales tax revenue include any gas tax, gasoline tax?
No,
No, it does not.
it does not.
Yeah.
Do we rely at all on gas tax?
We do. We very much do.
Now,
Is that where is that?
So
there's sales tax on gasoline, and so when gasoline goes up, you will see your Measure A and your basic 1%. The other thing I want to point out about this chart, this is your 1% sales tax revenue. This doesn't include Measure A. It's too recent to have a meaningful trend. But it saw similar upticks, but you got to realize, it doesn't go into place until a full year until 20. So it's not a meaningful trend.
Oh,
But nonetheless,
wait,
although that base is flattened out by
Bill,
40%
Bill,
from
Right.
2018,
Bill,
you have had strong
we
growth.
have a follow-up.
I just realized because I'm looking at back of the budget. You mean taxes from the gasoline stations versus like franchise gas, like the
so
Correct.
gas,
well,
like
gas-
Chevrons
gas-
and
yeah.
Put in
So
your gas you put in your car.
yes. So it's considered almost like a sales generated tax, but we refer to it as highway user transportation, HUDA monies, but we refer to it as gas tax.
Okay.
And that is not part of this. That is in its own separate fund because those monies are restricted for very specific purposes. And so, so that is a separate fund. And in the budget document on page 25, you'll see that broken out separately, and it'll literally say gas tax, and it'll show you the revenues, expenditures,
Okay,
and so
thank
forth.
you, John. And I don't know how significant it is, but in Sacramento last week, they were talking about, 24% of new vehicles are now EVs.
Yes,
And I think the state of California is surprised at how quickly the EVs are
adoption.
catching on. And so they expect the sales tax and all the other taxes on gasoline to really plummet.
yes.
So I just wanted to, and I don't know how significant that is to our budget.
Yeah, so I've heard these type of conversations before, really for almost like the last 2 years, that as EVs come on the market more and more. So one of the things there is, and this is always an assumption, that they cannot lose that kind of revenue. So they're going to, at the state level, do something about this. Some of it right now, I know that they're talking about, adding an additional cost on registration. There may be other avenues for them to generate revenue. But even with that said, obviously I'm speculating, period.
Thank you. So John,
Your
just for-
number three
for
most important
consistency's
revenue
sake,
source is utility users
23 and
tax.
24 on those slides too. Thank you. Appreciate that.
This has been amazingly stable over a 10-year period of time. But the important thing is, or as you look at trends, in the last 2 years, this is actually up by 6% a year. So while the longer term trend has been flatter, the more recent ones are up by 6% a year. And maybe that's not so surprising. If you take a look at your gas bill, you take a look at your electric bill, and you pay your utility users tax on top of that. So as those rise, so will your utility users tax. So that gets to kind of the capstone slide. And that's from a percentage perspective, what the assumptions are, or at least my assumptions at this point for key growth trends. I want to point out for property tax and sales tax, I had a big assist from your sales tax, from your advisor, Hinder Lighted Alamas, HDL. They do projections both for sales tax as well as for property tax. As you're aware, on the property tax side, there's the 2% limitation under Proposition 13. So why do property taxes rise more than 2%? Well, that's sales. And so when a home that sold 5 years ago for $1 million now sells for 1.5, you get to capture that increment. HDL has a pretty sophisticated model where they try and evaluate how much recapture value is there from homes that haven't recently turned over. And so they're really looking at something between 4 to 5%, with maybe some leavening on my part. Because here's the one bad news from my perspective. Because interest rates are high right now, and hopefully they'll come down at some point in the next 2 or 3 years to quote more normal levels. But high mortgage interest rates could hold up the resale of homes. And I might normally have this at 6 or 7% over the next 3 to 5 years. But I think 7% mortgage rates will slow down the resale of homes. So this is, my take on being cautiously optimistic about what happens with property values. Back in the Great Recession, South Pasadena may have seen some slowing down in assessed valuation increases, but you didn't see any decreases. But that's not true throughout the rest of the state. So, you have a very resilient housing market here, which I'm not giving you any insights you don't have just by driving around your community every day. On sales tax, HDL sees sort of a softening in 2004-05, barely not quite 1%, but in the later years after that, they see this growing by about 3% a year. Utility users tax, based on the last 2 years, I could be more aggressive on this, but I'm aware that there were years where it was relatively flat. So I want to take a relatively cautious approach to what I project for that. So the short story on this is these are intended to be cautiously optimistic. Without that, the recession is postponed for at least the next 5 years, or we do have the soft landing. There's going to be some increase in revenues, but they're all things considered, they're going to be modest. And I want to stop here and ask, do these seem to be, based on kind of where we've been, where we are today, these sort of seem like reasonable assumptions for these three top revenue sources?
Comments? I would take silence as agreement. Silence means agreement.
Okay. So let's talk about the other side of the coin, what's happening with operating costs. I'm looking at three key drivers on that. One, what are your already agreed upon employee agreements have to say about staffing costs? Got to revisit insurance, even if briefly. And then we'll talk about CalPERS, which is probably the biggest outstanding liability that you have and how that's likely to affect you over the next 5 years. Again, we take a look, your general fund budget's 39.1 million. Not surprisingly, police and fire is basically 50% of that. When you look at how you incur those costs by type, it's not surprising. Staffing's almost 70%, because how do you arrest bad guys? How do you put the wet stuff on the red stuff? You do that with police officers, you do that with firefighters. So staffing's almost is basically 2/3 of your total cost. And so we'll sort of peel those back and see what's happening. You're really fortunate. You had long-term labor agreements with your employee groups. They went from 2022 through the end of 24-25, and basically covering all of your organized groups. For the sworn group, the police group, for the sworn officers, they have a 4% raise coming up in 24-05. Their non-sworn people like dispatchers, have 3% coming up. Firefighters in that group, they're 4%, so pretty comparable to the police officers. And for the rest of your organized employees that aren't in the police or fire unit, they're scheduled for 2%. So when I look at your operating costs going forward, I will segment out these costs and apply these MOA costs against those each individual groups. Insurance, again, I don't want to belabor this other than to indicate that I'm including the 2003-04 insurance costs. Again, they're about 15% more than the average. I'll be using an amortization of $156,000 over the next 10 years. And again, there is a strong possibility that you could recover $2.5 million from your excess insurance carrier. But for the main event, really, when we look at operating costs and segregate those out, that's really what's happening with your California public employers retirement system costs, CalPERS. CalPERS has been around 90 years. They were formed in the 1930s. Virtually every city in California is a member of CalPERS. There's 482 cities in California, and 460 of them are members of CalPERS. When you look at all the agencies, cities, counties, and special districts, there's 2,900 agencies that are part of CalPERS with over 2 million participating members. It is the largest pension fund in the United States, and they manage close to $500 billion in assets. So a little bit about the city's costs, a little bit of background. You're pooled with other agencies that have similar benefits that are under 100, that have under 100 employees in each of their groups. There are two tiers based on the Public Employees Pension Reform Act of 2013. It is hard for me to believe that it's been 10 years. It's been 10 years since since PEPRA, which is the acronym, was adopted. So you have two tiers. Since 2013, anyone who is new to CalPERS, not necessarily new to the city, if they transfer from another agency, they can potentially bring that benefit with them. But if they're new to the CalPERS system from January 1st of 2013, they're going to be under the PEPRA tier. which in general, not necessarily true for you, but in general are have fewer benefits than the quote classic employees who were with CalPERS before 2013. And CalPERS is called those classic. For those of you who remember, there really was a Coke Classic at one time. Nobody thought the old Coke, the new Coke was particularly tasty. So we don't have that anymore. But they call those employees who've been in the system since 2013. Those are classic employees. So what do those two tiers look like? First, let's talk about PEPRA. This is the new tier. This is quote the lower tier. Actually, for your safety employees, that formula is 2.7 and 57. So what does that mean? That means for every year of service you have, you earn 2.7 up to age 57. So for example, if you came to work for a PERS agency and you were 25 as a police officer, and you work for 30 years and retire at 32 years at 57, you'll get 86% of your pay. You'll get 2.7 times 32. A couple of things important about that are changes. Used to be some agencies you would get that formula applied against your single highest year. For PEPRA employees, it's the average of your 3 years. And it's important to recognize your PERSable base, if you will, does not include special compensation, does not include overtime. It's really just whatever your base salary was while you were working. And if you're not safety, sworn employee, firefighter, police officer, then you're in quote the miscellaneous group. Someday they got to come up with a better name than miscellaneous, but you're in the miscellaneous group. And that's 2% at 62. So here's the interesting thing when you compare that to classic. Your PEPRA benefits are actually better than your classic benefits were before PEPRA came into place. There's actually an advantage to you in this. Because when you go to recruit for anyone who's new as a firefighter or a police officer since 2013, whether they're with another agency for 10 years or whether they're an entry-level officer for you, you are not at a competitive disadvantage in recruiting for those public safety employees. If you were still at 2% at 50, it would be very, very, very difficult for you to get sworn police and fire employees. But you're not at a competitive disadvantage in that case because the PEPRA benefit is actually better than the classic benefit that you had at one time. On the other hand, miscellaneous used to be 2% at 55, and now they're 2% at 62. But again, this has been around for 10 years. Anyone who's new to public employment in the last 10 years, they're at 2% at 62 as well. So I have to be honest, initially when I looked at your classic versus your PEPRA, I really thought you were in a competitive disadvantage in recruiting for some of these new positions, but you're not because PEPRA is not new anymore. You have a wide variety to choose from on the miscellaneous employees, and you're very competitive on the public safety employees in terms of the current market. Put this a little bit in context for reasons I won't go into unless you beg me. 3% at 50 was really the industry standard until 10 years ago. So when it was 3% at 50 for most sworn and police officers, at 2% at 50, you were at a significant competitive disadvantage. But 2.7 at 57, that's the new benchmark throughout the state for public safety employees. You should be in pretty good shape to be able to recruit new police and fire employees. If you look at how CalPERS funds those benefits, it really has two basic sources: the investments it earns on the money it's collected and the contributions from employees and employers. When you put that in perspective and it highlights the importance of investments, that pays for 2/3 of all of the employee benefits. Only 1/3 comes from employee and employer contributions. And when you look at the employer contribution is statutory, it's around 7%. The employer contribution, that's whatever it takes to actuarially fund the system. So it floats and it varies. And when you look at the employer contribution, there's really two important components to that. There's what's called the normal cost. That's what should be contributed as a percentage of payroll going forward, if there were no unfunded liabilities, this is the quote normal contribution. And they separate that out from what is the unfunded actuarial liability. The normal payroll, the normal cost, that's funded through a payroll contribution as a percentage of payroll. But the unfunded liability, that's just a fixed number based on what it takes to amortize over a 30-year period of time, what it takes to amortize any unfunded liabilities. There are a number of factors that end up driving rates in their projection for what inflation is going to be, their projection for what your earnings are going to be during your work lifetime, life expectancy. And then the fourth, but most important, is the discount rate. Really, basically, what are their investment yields? And that's really the most significant variable here. The current assumption is CalPERS will earn 6.8% interest on that. That's changed in just a year and a half from 7%. And it may not seem like it, but small changes in this rate can have huge consequences in terms of what the unfunded liability is and what the contributions need to be. This is an interesting chart. This is 19 years worth of CalPERS investment earnings. And you can see every year they are way over the map. They have years where they earn 20%, 21%, 23%. They have one stellar year here at the height of the Great Recession. They lost 23%. Other years in between where they've done pretty well, 15%, 12%. A couple of years there where they're not hitting that target at all. They're still positive, but they're not hitting that target. In 2022, that's so when COVID hits, they lost 6.1%. Last year, a little bit more favorable, they earned 5.8%, but keep in mind, they were supposed to earn 6.8. So when you look at those last 2 years, you might, oh, these almost cancel each other out. No. They were supposed to basically earn 7% in each of those years. So actuarially, because they're essentially flat, they've lost 14% of their actuarial value in the last 2 years. This is going to be reflected in the rates coming up. And in fact, the most recent rates from CalPERS just came out in the fall of 23. They reflect the 6.1% loss. So that's kind of good news, at least in understanding what's going forward. But we won't really see what the implications are of having earned 5.8 instead of 6.8. We won't see that for another year. Now, because they spread it, because they defer its implementation by a year in order to provide stability, even with that loss, I don't think the city is going to see any significant jump above the significant jump you're already going to see. Okay, so this is what the normal contribution rate looks like for safety employees, sworn police and fire. This is not surprising. This is very stable at about 23%, but that's because it's the normal rate. There are no unfunded liabilities in this. So assuming they earn 6.8% a year, which is their assumption, you see the normal rate very, very, very stable at 23%. And the same is true for miscellaneous employees. The blue bars are actual, the red bars are what's projected to happen. Again, these are very consistent at about 13% of salary. So the normal costs are not really necessarily where we need to look and be concerned, but the UAL, the unfunded accrued liability, that's significant.
Bill, could you do just visually, can you do me a favor? And I'll own this one. At the top of each one of those bars, can you put the percentage?
Yeah, each one of those bars is the rate that's going to be in place that fiscal year.
I appreciate that, but at the top of the bar, could you put the actual number?
The red ones are what are forecast.
I understand. Can you put your projected percentage at the top of those bars? You understand, Suli? Thank you. Never mind. Suli's got me. Yeah, exactly.
It's a percentage of their payroll.
No. The rates. Yeah. You did a great job of convincing us that small changes have big. Anything. Make it easy for me.
Yeah, these numbers are highly unlikely to be significantly different than what's presented here.
Oh, yeah, we appreciate that. But what I'd like to know is what is the number that's being presented, Bill?
Well, it's going to be this percentage applied against the cost of the payroll.
Okay.
So is the cost
You got me.
likely, is the cost likely to go up if employee compensation goes up? Yes,
Thank you.
but the percentage is going to stay relatively stable.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it.
But it's a different story when we look at the UAL costs, which are not a percentage of payroll. These are fixed dollars that CalPERS looks towards to be paid in full. And you can see there in the last 3 years, actually the UAL contribution, this is not the total amount of unfunded liability. This is the amortized amount that you have to pay every year to CalPERS. It was actually starting to come down. Why? Because until it lost 6%, it actually had a pretty strong investment the year before. But you can see here, these are going to continue to rise from about 2.5 million in 24-25 to about 3.5 million by the end of the forecast period.
So Bill, what fund does that get paid out of, the UAL costs?
So the UAL costs are being distributed for every department. So in our budget, we actually have a separate line. I intentionally put a separate line in the general ledger and in the budget lines for every single department within every fund, the UAL. So in other words, for example, say if the UAL for police is, $3 million for this year, in other words, the contribution, that there is a line item for that within the budget. And the reason for that is I wanted to segregate that from normal employer pension cost. And the reason for that is this. So the unfunded costs that we pay every year, if we laid everyone off in the city, we'd still have that obligation. It would never go away.
Correct.
As opposed to the active pension costs, you have someone, they make $100,000, and if the normal cost is 10%, our expenditure is $10,000 per year. It's important to always separate those two components.
Sure, but what we're saying is that we're looking at operating expenditures increasing for the UAL.
Yes.
$1 million. Several $1 million over the every year over year for the next 5 years. So,
and
so-
something else I just want to kind of add to this for the UAL. So when you have a year where we have higher than expected revenues or we have losses, what PERS does to reduce volatility is they spread those out over 10 years. So there's layers. And so on the UAL, when we look at the total UAL for our pension plans, they literally will have a series of layers for all the gains and losses that have occurred, and where they're amortizing 1 year out of that 20-year period that derives how we get to that UAL figure. And so we actually have schedules for that. We actually have very detailed schedules on that. They're not presented in here, but we go through that when we're doing the budgets and so forth.
So
John, oh, sorry.
no, I was just going to ask, so do we have a growth rate on these costs? I haven't done the math on this one, to see what we're projecting as the annual growth rate for the UAL costs.
So what I was gonna say is, I kind of recall months ago, we have a consultant, I thought, that does all the projections on with respect to CalPERS.
So CalPERS actually provides their own actuarial reports. And so they're always a 1-year lag, always on there. But nonetheless, there's a component within the actual reports, the pension reports, where they show what they expect the UAL to do over a 5-year period. So it's always a rolling 5 years.
Right. So what I was asking is actually the impact to our budget.
Yes.
For the growth rate for that cost, because again, we're kind of operating on, no matter how you look at it, on a thin margin right now in our operating budget. So
Mhm.
to have a sense of what costs increases that we should be expecting coming up.
Yeah,
You should-
we can easily provide that.
Thank you.
That's a very readable,
Thank you.
we can do that fairly quickly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Bill,
And miscellaneous looks very similar. Again, in the third actual year, the blue bar, it actually started to moderate a little bit. But then again, starting in 2024, it's going to increase from somewhere like about 1.3 million to a little about 1.7. So not as drastic as safety, but safety benefits are more expensive, but it's really the same basic story. And these are important in terms of looking out into the future to fold in these higher costs. So other operating costs, once I segment out the insurance, segment out the MOU cost, this is what I plan on doing with the balance, is basically having it increase by inflation. And these are my inflation assumptions. And in 24, 25, still not going to come down to 2%, but it'll come down to 2.5%. And then in the out years, it'll be 2%. And this will be kind of the assumption. Could costs increase by more than this? Of course they could. But from my perspective, once your costs are increasing by more than about inflation, you're making some policy decisions about what those costs should be. Actually, let me stop here and say, so those are sort of the key operating cost assumptions. This seem reasonable.
Bill, aside from some of the adjustments we asked you to make and considerations we put on the table, I think that they are reasonable.
General fund
I
subs- oh,
honestly,
I'm
I'm gonna
sorry.
say, I'm not sure I can say that based, because you seem to have put in a lot of things into here. I would actually like to see more of a breakout into with the increase in operating costs, because this is growth by inflation, but we just saw in CalPERS that we're expecting substantial increases. There's no percentage number associated with those cost increases, but they are going to be cost increases that are part of our operating budget. I also am concerned about the way baseline was developed with this idea of taking anything considered one time, even though we're going to have them over and over again. So I don't feel completely comfortable with this assumption, because I don't feel like it's actually been fleshed out enough for an operating cost assumption. Because also, like, I mean, I'm looking back at the budget analysis and I was seeing a growth rate that was higher. And that's my problem for the historical. So I'm confused why it would drop so significantly, because that's not what happened.
And Commissioner Rossi, so we can always address these things. So, including this here, so that so it's fully vetted, so you have confidence with it. And if you disagree with it, we can, it's a discussion or whatever in terms of assumptions on there. But I'm happy to go, anything you want to point out to dive into and get further breakdown and analysis for you.
Yeah, because I mean, from what I understand, November 1st is a final report that's going to the city council.
Yes, November 1st, correct.
So we need to flush things out now.
Sure.
And I think
No,
that's
absolutely.
kind of the issue.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And John, we have a meeting scheduled for the 26th of October.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. So
Me too.
So we were going to bring up tonight, because of the proximity to November 1st, we were originally thinking, okay, we would propose to have a joint meeting on the 1st to go over the report. That was the intention for tonight's, at the end of this conversation, to get the commission's feedback on what they would like to do. With that. The other thing with respect to whether it's, we stay with the 26th or we do the joint meeting, is at that point, I will put together probably some fairly solid year-end numbers. They're still not the audited numbers, so there still could be adjustments and things. But I think for the most part, by that point, the numbers are going to be pretty solid. You're not going to see a lot of change from that point
Ju-
on. And it will give you a sense, for example, with the revenues, the property taxes, the sales tax, how are we doing with that?
Right.
Along with, the operating costs and the expenditures. So one of the things that we still have going through the process, we're going to be doing transfers to record at year end. We're going to be doing allocations, for example, at year end, a lot of things like that we're still in process on.
Okay.
On there. And those really need to be done so that you have a better true sense of the year end. And so my intention was I wanted to really get to that point because that was going to be more relevant to, I think, this commission than anything else.
John, I was not proposing we canceled the 26th.
Okay.
My question for you was, can you get this all done by the 26th in anticipation of the joint meeting on November 1st?
Well, we can definitely try to pull out all the stops on there. It's again, because now we're down staff.
You're down
we're,
one significant player.
on there, and again, we are in the thick of year end, and we're just trying to get that done.
Okay, so I think we're out of a sequence here, but to finish this thought, at the end of this meeting, commissioners, let's think about what we want to see on the 26th to give John some direction to make sure that he is putting finite amount of resources against the right challenges. Okay, so does that sound reasonable? Perfect. John, don't let us get out of here before midnight and have that decision made. Okay. Thank you. Any further questions for Bill?
Last component or sixth component, we talked about general fund subsidies. Again, I will be including this in the base forecast, even though it isn't technically an expenditure. It is absolutely a use of general fund resources. And why are you making, and this is likely to grow by more than inflation, because even if the underlying costs grow by inflation, if the revenue stays fixed, then even if the costs grow modestly, that subsidy is going to grow at a faster rate.
Yes.
Seventh item is population growth and new development. In some communities, this is a key factor, but you've been about 26,000 for 10 years in a row with maybe a fluctuation of a couple hundred people one way or another. So the short story is population growth is unlikely to play any significant factor in your fiscal outlook. And so the last component is capital improvements. This is the assumption that I plan on using is the 5-year CIP that was submitted with your budget. The first year at 23-24 is 1.4 million. That's what you've adopted. But if we move forward and take a look at the projects you have outlined that you've identified as being general fund sources in the CIP, that goes up to about 2.8 million in 24-25. This is a copy command problem. Every one of those should start with the next year's number. Ignore the 23, look at the ending year.
Got it.
And so for the next 4 years, it's somewhere between 2.8 and 2 million. Because it's a 5-year forecast, including 23-24, I have to make an assumption for the 5th year and not make it totally unreasonable when assume it's the same as the prior 2 years. This is more, and even though you might look at the individual projects and think this is a little bit light, this is still significantly more than you did in 23-24, and it's significantly more than you've historically done over the last several years. So it's not so big that it disputes that distorts this by having $20 million a year, but it probably is a little light on maybe what some folks would like to see it being in the infrastructure plans. And that's really what the next slide does. Because as I worked with Ted in putting this together, it turns out not only are there the general fund projects and then the ones that are funded by water and sewer and other sources, but there's a significant amount of CIP projects that are shown in that 5-year CIP for which no funding has been identified. This is a pretty aggressive capital improvement plan at 3.7 in 24-25, not necessarily so much, but there are some very big stormwater flood protection projects that are envisioned in the 5-year CIP. I don't know how much the council discussed those projects. I don't know how much of a policy commitment there is to wanting to do those. But really, when you look at those projects, most of those may be in the library area, maybe in the parks area. Transportation may look fairly reasonable. These are very big projects for stormwater. Why have I included them as at least as information? Because if some of these are very high priority projects, which I don't know, then the general fund is the likely funding source for that. Because if you could have identified somebody, kind of Abraham Lincoln's proverbial man behind the tree, I'm sure your staff would have. So these are projects without any particularly identified funding source, and they're detailed in the report. I summarized them here. But this is an area where, again, these are assumptions that I'm making about the CIP. They're not intended to be policy decisions about what projects you should or you shouldn't include. But I did think it was important when you look at that 5-year CIP, and maybe you saw some project. Oh, look, we're planning on doing this. Well, not really. We've identified it as a priority, at least in public works. But whether it's a priority to use limited general fund money this way is an entirely different matter, which just really leaves me with this as we've been discussing all of this. The forecast is based on assumptions. Try real hard to avoid policy decisions or something that looks like I'm weighing in on a policy decision, trying to make reasonable assumptions about what I think is likely over the next 5 years. But clearly, if there are high priority projects that I haven't included, or projects that aren't particularly high priority, but I have included them, the rationale on the basis is they're in your 5-year CIP. So here's a summary. The purpose of this outlook and the key assumptions has really just been to kind of lay that out for you in terms of what are the factors that are going to drive results. This will obviously be placed in a more empirical context once I finish developing the model, once I apply these assumptions. And again, the goal is to get back to a joint session of the Finance Commission and the City Council on November 1st. Just a little bit about the road ahead. Regardless of the specific outcome, maybe you have extra money every year we can apply towards new initiatives. Maybe you have a gap that you're going to have to make up somehow or another. But either way, in both good times and bads, of all the things you want to do for South Pasadena to stay a cool community, what are the most important things to do? And what are the resource trade-offs you have to do in order to make those? That's not going to alter really the math and the policies that's behind this, whether this has a very favorable outlook or has a less than favorable outlook. And here's, at least for my evening, this is my favorite slide because this is the last one. Happy to answer any sort of final wrap-up questions you may have.
Commissioners, bless you. Commissioners, any further questions? Any questions that haven't been asked? No? Okay. Bill, thank you so much. And
well, thank
we
you very
appreciate
much. This has been a very enjoyable 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And here's the scary part. Now I'm got finance officer running through my veins. So this kind of discussion actually, is kind of catnip to me. And I realize I may have a high capacity for this. It doesn't mean the rest of you do. So I appreciate your indulgence. And thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. Okay. My assumption is we're going to be continuing to review this document, and we will continue to review the updates to this document and the revisions and the enhancements to the document. And then at that point, probably on the 26th, we're going to have to determine what position this commission is going to take in presenting it to during the joint meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. That is, thank you. There you go. This is my straight person over here. Okay. So let's put that on you, John. How can we get the document ahead of the 26th so that we can review it and come ready, willing, and able to
Sure.
fine tune it?
So what that means is we're going to have to make the revisions and incorporate, all the changes that have been requested, if you will. Basically the week before, so whatever the Thursday is before the 26th, is really when we're going to have to get that information to you.
You must, and then.
Yeah, no, I don't see any other way around
So,
it.
so John, and I'm sorry, Chair. It seems that there's a lot to do and you guys are very busy. I don't know what the magic is to November 1st.
Thank you.
And so I'm
Thank
just
you.
wondering whether this is something we should take up with Armine.
Yes.
I just don't, I don't have an idea for why it might have just been that sort of made sense, but it seems to me with given the amount of things that have to happen, it might be better to push this back.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree more. Is there magic around November 1st? It was simply, that was just a target date.
That was a target date.
Okay. I don't know why I wouldn't want to spend Christmas with the city council. As delightful as those people are, okay? So at the end of the day, Janet, can we ask you to approach the city council? Maybe there's something we're not seeing the
Yeah.
magic with John or the rest of the council. Okay. And would you take as a to-do to talk to Armine? I would propose we push that out at least 30 days. I would rather give December 6th, okay? I'd rather get a solid close to the year
Mm-hmm.
and you have all of your ducks in a row, John.
Yeah.
And give your team the opportunity to do their due diligence to make sure that we close out 22, 23 in a stellar fashion than for us to rush, to be honest with you. Am I the only one?
I
thinking this way?
agree.
Okay, so that's the direction. Yeah, I'd rather have you folks put all of your attention closing out 22, 23, and then bringing that to us on the 26th. Too many 20s here.
So do we need to go ahead and make a formal movement on that? 'Cause I think
That's my
what we're
next question.
missing.
Esteban, does that have to be?
We probably should, and I do want to make a point that it would be, if we did meet on the 26th, it would be very hard to put it on the 1st because the packet goes out that same night we'd be meeting. And it would be very hard to put that information on the packet to go.
We've
on the
already been
next
through
meeting.
that nonsense in June. We don't want to do
Right.
that again.
Plus, we're a Halloween town and a Halloween hangover happens on November 1st. I just want to point that out.
Yeah.
John, you should come and see what happens here on Halloween. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. It's too much fun. Okay.
Sure.
Yes. So. Esteban,
Probably go ahead and make a motion also to include the changes you want. And then what meeting are you proposing? Or are you saying to go back to Armine and ask her what the council as well to see what
I
their
don't think,
best-
so November 1 is not currently on your calendar, right?
wasn't on
That-
our
that is
No,
correct.
it's not on the
It was
Finance
just being
Commission
proposed tonight.
calendar, so I don't think they have to change it because it was never really on the calendar.
correct. So, and then the next city council meeting is the December 6th. 3 days later, December 6th. First Wednesday. Are we correct, Esteban?
There's a meeting on November 15th, but again, I
December
think the
6th, the first one.
question for Armine is, yeah, the month out would be
Yeah.
December 6th.
Yeah.
I-
So.
Yeah,
So December 6th would be the first one. I just don't know what's on that agenda. Might be very heavy for December.
Okay.
Is there one before November?
So let's just push it out 30 days, Esteban.
Okay.
Perfect.
And we can
Please
have
don't
the
open your
the
calendars anyway.
discussions with
Just do
Armine
not.
and follow up with the commission, so that we lock in a date that works for everyone.
For the joint meeting? Or
For the joint meeting, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think we need to make a motion. We just have your notes and then we'll
don't think
take
so
it
either.
and we'll come back with dates, right, John?
I
Yes.
just want to make
Okay.
sure that
Yes.
it's captured in the records.
Please.
Yeah, yeah.
Please.
We will do that and then send you guys the minutes for, confirmation that did we capture everything or have we missed something? Oh, no,
Yeah, there
absolutely.
were so many points at which we were asking adjustments to be made. I didn't take notes. I apologize. I probably.
I
should.
took some notes, but we can always go back and look at the video.
Let's put that in the, can you get those to us in a timely fashion, Esteban?
Sure.
So that while it's fresh in everyone's mind, we can take a look at our notes and enhance them if necessary.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much. So we just made a couple of decisions. We're going to push out the joint session at least 30 days. We're asking you to come on the 26th of October, prepared to give us as close to final numbers.
Revised estimates for the assumptions for discussion. And, obviously seeking Finance Commission recommendations at that point.
That would be helpful. I would also like to see the final numbers for 22, 23. That's more important to me personally.
Sure,
On the 26th.
sure. Okay.
Okay.
So you want that to be the priority.
That is priority,
Yep.
and revised assumptions would be a second tier. If possible, but what I'd prefer you doing is treating your team in a responsible fashion. We understand the stress we put on you folks.
And look, I mean, there was a lot of discussion tonight about the insurance fund and whatnot, and
Yep.
I honestly don't care about like the one-time expenditures. And I understand that those weren't issues that this finance team brought forward. But getting the assumptions correct on the revenues and expenditures going forward does make a big impact. Because I'm looking at our capital improvement plan, the one that is currently in the budget that is supposed to be funded. If we're on thin margins, even if you back out the one-time expenditures, you do all of the adjustments, we agree to all of the assumptions currently that's in this plan, that's $300,000 a
It's
year.
then, yeah.
We will not have money for any of this, and we're not going to have money for the expenditures that are coming along with CalPERS. So
Right.
that's where I honestly, like, what frustrates me is I don't want to argue about these kind of questions. I want to get into how do we address our increasing expenditures and these changes in revenues, whether it's a statewide or whatnot, and it's going to the state and figuring out how do we say, okay, if everything's going to online shopping and that's a big source of our income, how do we go back and start thinking through that? How do we deal with electric vehicles and decline in sales tax for gases? Like, this is where I'd rather be spending our time. We're on thin margins. We don't have this money because this will deplete the general fund balance quickly. It'll be gone. So that's where I'd like to get to, is having those conversations.
And that's yes. Yeah. And we appreciate what your team's bringing to the table right now, John. We understand that these are not your problems. You didn't create them, but you're here to help us solve them.
Well, and I'm trying to, have accurate projections. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
that's my number one goal.
May I just give you some counsel though? Don't allow the pursuit of 100% accuracy to bring thoughts or your best guesstimates to this team. We will hear you. We'll understand. You can put all the caveats you want around it. Okay. But we'd like to have that information. Okay. And I
Absolutely.
promise you, we will not hold you accountable for an estimate unless you're wildly incompetent. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, she will. Okay. There was another recommendation made in Esteban. I don't know if we need to take a vote on this, to create an insurance working sub-team. Would have to make a motion on that? Help me?
I believe a general consensus would be sufficient, but the commission is
Matt,
welcome to
Matt?
make a motion if they'd like.
I am so sorry. I didn't hear what you said. Your mic wasn't on.
The commission can choose to do so by a general consensus, with the details to be determined with a further maybe discussion offline, if are more than a quorum's worth of interested parties. But the commission is also welcome to make a motion if they'd like to.
Okay. What is the most I guess accurate way to do it, or most appropriate way to do it? I'm open to your counsel. I don't know.
Chair, is it something your commission would like to do? It would be my
I
question.
think there's energy around it. to be
Okay,
honest with you, Jen.
Okay,
Yes. Would anyone like to form a 2 or 3 person?
it needs to be two,
needs-
because three is a quorum, and then you're violating the Brown Act.
Thank you very much. Good reminder. Appreciate it. A 2-person subcommittee. Thank you, Sheila. I have no background in insurance.
I don't either. It's all learning experience. You know, I'd be willing to.
Okay. So the decision. Okay, I make a motion that we form a working group, a subcommittee ad hoc group that will take a look at the insurance question, possibly bring John or any member of his team into that conversation, and then report back to us, hopefully with a preliminary report on the 26th. Okay, can you do that? Second? All in favor? Aye. Okay. Opposed? Thank you. I'm sorry. Roll call vote. No, I don't think so. Okay, insurance claims. John, next thing on the agenda.
Chair, who made the second on the motion?
Cynthia.
Commissioner Quaid? Okay.
John,
Yes.
you gave us a teaser on this about 2.5 hours ago. Please bring it forward.
So within the agenda packet, Commissioner Rossi, I promised her on the last meeting that we would break down the settlements between the settlements and the legal component of those settlements. And so within your agenda packets, that's what this schedule is here for fiscal year 22-23.
No, are these estimates or are these actual?
These are not estimates. These are actuals.
Okay.
This is what we've actually paid out, and we've broken it out between the settlement component and the legal component of these.
So I think Chair Giuliani had actually recommended that we have a report that started in 2018, 2019, because one of the issues that I see, I mean, these are all settled, but the legal fees incurred in this year or in total for the cases.
For the year.
So that's a problem because that's
Yeah.
now mixing apples and oranges. So if you have a case that was $250,000,
Right.
and let's just say hypothetically that somebody had tracked
Yes.
the case. And here it says $17,000 of legal fees, but I know that in 1 year alone, there was $117,000 of legal fees,
Mhm.
and the number is probably several $100,000 higher. That doesn't give a good understanding of what happened with those settlements. These are settled cases, and so they're also now public record.
Yeah.
So there is what happened in totality with that settlement, because that gives us the picture of what Carl Warren got, what was in the claims and judgments that have been happening and been increasing if they haven't been being covered.
Sure. So I'm going to have to work with our risk manager on that. I don't know how far back they have gone. So for example, you've heard me mention, that we have this, we've submitted claims up to $2.5 million for prior years. I don't have the details to say, what years did those fall into. So I would have to kind of dig into this and see what that's going to take, what we currently have versus say additional work to do that.
Mhm.
And I only say that in the context of because everything that we have on our plate right now.
Yeah. So
So I totally understand your point.
Right.
Yes, so this isn't representative of what actually happened. I think that's what we
Yeah.
wanted to try to find out what happened in the claims and judgment piece. And to
Sure.
see how off track some things may have gotten.
Right. Right.
A settlement. Mhm. Correct, because that's actually what ended up happening in the claims and judgment, right? Correct, correct. Yes. Yes, so for instance, if you had a settlement of 250,000, but you spent 500,000 plus on legal fees because you chose not to settle it in the first year, like those are kind of the decision-making things because it impacts.
Right. So yes, we did ask for that, and I do recall asking for that. However, I'm gonna ask you to put this in the hierarchy of what we want John to bring us on the 26th. Is this a first tier, second tier, or third tier breakdown? Yeah, so John, again, this can go into November. We'd rather have accurate numbers than fast numbers. So the group is, what you're hearing from the commissioners is, yes, we want the information, but we don't need it by the 26th of October if it puts everything else at risk.
Okay. And Commissioner Rossi, so how many years did you want us to
I
go
think we
back?
said 2018, 2019
Right.
was the baseline.
Well, and I think really to have an understanding, what were the legal fees exactly associated with the settlements, to know what was going into that 2 million something that you're saying to Carl Warren,
Yeah,
but yes.
sure,
I
Sure.
think the baseline that Chair Giuliani had recommended was 2018, 2019.
And then forward.
and going
Okay.
forward.
But again, John, not at the expense of doing the other work,
Just
please.
so long as it's noted in our minutes, so that
Perfect.
we
Yeah.
remember. Yeah.
So do we have to vote on? And is there anything to vote on here?
This item is an information item. I don't believe a vote
I
would be
didn't think so either.
necessary.
Thank you. Are there any more questions or concerns or direction to John and his team?
I just have a question on two line items, so I can throw it out of my head. Is the 6/30/2023 the past due ones from the CGPIA? Or, I mean, there are two like very large numbers and they
No,
both
this
fall on
is-
6/30/2023. So are those the past?
Yeah, so with respect to the JPIA, that covered from 1997 through 2013 cases.
So that's what the 959,000 is and the 795,000 is?
Yes, I'm sorry. So, I'm sorry, where are you?
On 6/30.
6/30/23, yeah. It's the last line item on each one of the charts.
I believe so, but I have to kind of confirm. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I just don't remember off the top. of my
No
head.
problem. I just was gonna say, if that's the case, you can go ahead and knock
Yes-
that out.
Yes, it is. But I
Yes.
made the accruals for it.
Yeah, so I mean, if that's the case, from my perspective, you can go ahead and knock that out. Like, I don't care for you to do any more analysis on that. We understand.
Okay, you got it.
Yeah.
Okay,
I apologize.
that was
for
easy. Put a check next to that.
Okay.
Thank you, Sue Lee. You should have jumped up there sooner, okay? Appreciate it. So, any other questions, comments, concerns? Thank you. On to item number 4, review of fiscal year 23-24 investment policy. I do have to ask a question. Is this an appropriate conversation to have without the city treasurer here?
So
The city treasurer is present on Zoom.
I can't hear you.
yeah, the city treasurer is present on Zoom.
Oh, she is?
Yes. But from what I noticed, when we attached this document, we were missing a couple of pages on the investment policy. I know you guys were more focused on the Bill Statler report. Well, thank you, Cynthia, for catching that. The investment report only had page 1. And then I believe in your packet right now, we printed out this page 1 through 4. So it should have 4 pages.
So the challenge is, I'm not sure how we're supposed to review the investment policy. Because this is an investment, I have in the agenda packet, it was investment policy.
Yes, that's an investment policy that we would just want, the commission to review. So if you give the okay to,
But how do we review the policy? Like, have there been any changes made to the policy?
no, so that's what I was gonna go over.
Okay.
Like, I haven't made any changes to a policy because what I do on a year-to-year basis is I go onto the LAIF website. It's a local agency investment guidelines. And I read through their guidelines to see if anything changed from prior year to the current year. So if there's no changes, then our policy pretty much remains the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this has been reviewed by our city treasurer?
I sent it to her, but I don't believe she had the time to review it yet.
Okay.
And so I would,
Neat.
Yeah, I don't think you guys got the time to look at it or review it either.
Same policy we've had for the
A number of years. Yeah,
Okay.
it's the same as last year's policy.
commission. If I don't,
Okay.
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 So my one question though, as long as we're talking about the investment policy and reports, is that last night's city council meeting, the city council received the monthly investment report for July 2023. But the finance commission has never received it and it wasn't even included in this agenda packet. So from a procedural standpoint, I'm not sure why the finance commission isn't receiving the investment policy reports and having the treasurer talk about any concerns or whatnot. Because there was an interesting line item in the investment policy where we had projected with prior year, and you guys don't have this information because it wasn't in our packet, but projected expenditures for the next 6 months, prior year, same period is $24 million. For fiscal year 2024 adopted budget, it's $42 million. So these are kind of things that like it should be coming to the finance commission.
Okay, I
Right.
agree. I agree. I think one of the issues that we had that maybe we need to talk about for next year's planning calendar, we have the commission meeting at the end of the month, and then we have our council meeting at the first 2 meetings of the month.
Okay.
So it just kind of falls behind,
Right.
all of the council meetings.
But
So
this
maybe
is-
we could,
But this is a July 31st investment report, so that should have come to us in August.
it would be in September,
Or in September
Yes.
before going.
which is
Yeah,
this meeting.
correct. And actually talking from a procedural calendar section, like you do for proper oversight of finances, you do need some time to review them. And it is hard having a Thursday night meeting and getting documents on Monday night. I mean, I was up
Okay.
late last night trying to think things. So I'd like to figure out if we can vote on something different. So
Yeah. No,
not
I
for a different
agree.
night
I
meeting,
agree.
but if we could receive the documentation, especially anything that is financial review ahead of time, so we can have like a weekend, I'd like a weekend.
Can,
Past was always before
Okay.
city council. I don't know what's happened the last couple of months. But prior, we've always received before the council do it. And the treasurer always present at our.
Mhm.
we need to resume. So let,
Yeah, I apologize because she had an emergency meeting that she had to attend today and she's driving back down from up north. So we told her it's okay for her to attend on Zoom.
And she is here on Zoom if you have any, I think, questions.
Would the chair like the treasurer to be promoted to a panelist?
Yeah, and the part of the issue is that it went to the city council on a consent item, no discussion whatsoever. So it's basically just being filed away. So the treasurer isn't being held accountable, no offense then. But no, nobody is really looking at it and having eyes on it. It's just being filed. So even if it happens that way, where they copy us on it, there's never any discussion, just gets filed.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the July statement was copied to you after Zen's approval. Because usually Albert
didn't
does that,
receive
so
it.
I'm not sure if he CC'd.
Yeah, we haven't received it. This
Please.
is the
good, Fred.
I just want to repeat what I said before. Prior years, the treasurer was always at that meeting to present the treasurer's report.
Okay.
And we always saw the report prior to the announcement. Now, as you just said,
It's not required.
not required, but that was standard practice. And we appreciate that very much.
So let's do this. The item on our agenda is to approve the investment policy. Is that
Correct.
correct?
Correct.
Okay, so what I understand is that our colleagues have reviewed it in years past. There is no change. We're simply asked to continue the approval. Do I have a
And I
motion?
move it.
Okay, do I have a second? What, this
you.
requires a roll call vote, I believe.
Yes.
Yes. Commissioner Finley,
Yes.
Commissioner Quaid, Vice Chair Rossi,
yes.
and Chair Giuliani.
Yes. Okay. So the second thing I've heard proposed is that we encourage or go back to the practice of having the city treasurer here at our meetings, and that the city treasurer will review the investment report prior to presenting it to the city council. That's what I hear. Okay,
I move.
okay, so that is a recommendation. I heard a movement by Commissioner Friendly. Motion. Anybody second?
I second that.
Okay, second by Commissioner Rossi. Please give me a roll call vote.
Commissioner Finley,
Yes.
Commissioner Quaid, Vice Chair Rossi,
Yes.
Chair Giulioni.
Yes. So Zen, you have another meeting on your calendar. Anything else, Suli, anything else we need to understand about the investment report?
Not right now. So from what I'm understanding, you want to have the treasurer review and present to the commission the treasurer's report.
Yeah, not for approval, but review so that we understand it and before it goes to the city council.
Okay, because the August one is going to the city council, I believe. John, do you remember what date the August investment report is going to city council?
I'm sorry, what's the question again?
The August investment report. Do you know when it's going to city council? Do we have it for 11? No.
I'd have to go look at our agenda forecast.
So I think the
Okay.
main point is that the investment report should be reviewed by the Finance Commission prior to it be sent to the city council, because the city council is receiving it as in consent form only, as though,
Sure.
so there should be at least some procedure where we go through. And I mean, that kind of goes, I mean, we should have something for the monthly financial
Right.
reports are supposed to happen on a monthly basis. There's like a little structure to how our meetings, that we know every month we're going to be looking at these items and having a sense before it goes up. And I know, I'm not sure if you are aware of this, but another like approximately $200,000 of budget appropriations occurred last night. So our Bill Statler's numbers are actually further off because they didn't include those assumptions because they were approved by the city council. And I do find it strange that these kind of things are not being brought to the Finance Commission for discussion or review before it's heading to the city council. We are not going to be the ones who vote on it, but is the Finance Commission supposed to provide oversight or not?
And the comment was, John, traditionally it has happened in the past.
Mm.
And we just got out of the cycle. We got out of cycle
Okay.
and we'd like to get back in.
Sure.
Yeah,
No,
so for the
absolutely.
October 26th meeting with
Mm.
commission, we will add the August investment report. So
Thank
we have
you.
to push the August investment report with council into November.
Into November.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, so
Thank you.
after you guys review it, then we'll
Is-
put it.
Janet, will that cause upset with the city council? Yes, ma'am. I think it's prudent. I do. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we can
Thank
do
you,
that.
Suli. Appreciate you working that out for us. And then we're gonna have to figure out how to do this, the scheduling thing. This is the third or fourth time this meeting alone where the scheduling has created a problem. And I'm looking at you like it's your problem. It's not your problem. It's our
I'll take it,
problem,
I'll take
okay? But we have got to come to some sort of solution here, okay? And John, I would propose perhaps you and I meet one day and over lunch and try to figure this one out, because just plot this out. And it may, unfortunately, it may affect all of our planning, because I don't know about you, but I have these meetings on my calendar through the next 12 months. Yeah. So we're going to try to be as sensitive to that as humanly possible. But I do believe we need to meet before city council. I
Yes.
do.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's John, let's you and I pull a calendar out and let's plot that out for the balance of the year.
Okay.
About not balance of the calendar year, balance of the budget year,
Yeah.
the fiscal year. And then I will take as my responsibility to contact my colleagues and determine which one of the dates is least painful.
Yeah, and also keep in mind, November, there's no scheduled meeting for the commission.
That's because of Thanksgiving. Yeah. Remember, we did that consciously. That was a conscious decision. I remember.
I think, yeah, we never have a meeting in
Really?
November.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I
Okay.
believe July and November.
So we
Or-
may add one just to get back in cycle. Would it make, just generally, folks, that this is not a matter of record. Will it make anyone's November particularly unpleasant if we just added a meeting there and just got ahead of this?
It's on the day.
Okay. Okay, so we'll, John, I will poll my colleagues and we'll come up with some possibilities there.
Okay.
And then whether or not it's this room we're meeting in or somewhere else, sometimes it's scheduling. I know, we sometimes have problems rescheduling this room.
We'll make it work.
We'll figure it out. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay,
So-
thanks. Thank you, folks. I really appreciate your willingness to get us back in that cycle. Really?
I don't have anything in November. Can you pull up the calendar, Esteban?
Where it is, 6:30 on the 30th, yeah. On my calendar too.
So so if we have something before then, we'll simply move it before Thanksgiving. We'll throw it on the other side of Thanksgiving. Yeah, something like that. Okay, I will poll you folks. I'll send you a poll in via online polling, and we'll just talk about the dates. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Approval of the minutes. My assumption is that we have all had the opportunity to review the minutes. Of course, do we have to do each one separately, Esteban? Or can we do all three of them together?
You can do all three together. You would just need to indicate whether you are approving them as presented or as amended if there are any requested changes.
Let's first go through any amendments to the June 1st meeting minutes.
Chair, I'd suggest that my presence at the meetings be noted in the minutes.
Please, okay?
If that's that's pretty standard on all of the
Yes?
commissions that the council
Thank-
liaisons.
I don't remember you being here.
Yeah, I don't either.
If I was there.
So yes, please, can we amend each one of the meetings to include council member Braun as being present? Aside from that, on the June 1, any additional amendments or changes? Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
I'm sorry, this was action and discussion item 1. Item 2.
Motion by,
So this is June 1st.
Are you looking
So
at
this
review
was actually-
updated?
This was actually the contentious one where the motion was for us to, it would be approved on the condition that the finance commission members would go to the city council meeting and have a discussion with the city council. And then we showed up and the city council said, we never heard this was happening. So yes, I think that it was a conditional motion.
Yeah.
agreed, and to be honest with you, I do not recall.
That was the motion.
Okay.
There's video record.
So how should we amend it to make it more correct? That it was a conditional motion?
Well, the motion was to approve the budget on the condition that commissioners would go to the city council meeting and be provided an opportunity to discuss with council some of the concerns raised by the commission, as I recall. But we can watch a video of it and see
Yeah,
what
yeah.
it was. But it was.
I mean,
most definitely-
below it says Finance Commission recognized the movement of the city budget in the right direction. But they have identified a number of areas that we need to work on collaboratively between the council, commission, and the staff to identify strategies for improvement.
On which page?
On that
Right.
page?
That was.
That wasn't the motion?
No, the motion was that we approved it conditionally and said that the finance commission approved it, but would be sending finance commissioners to the city council meeting.
Let me rewatch the video and then we'll write
Absolutely.
a better amendment for this.
Would you?
Yeah.
So let's put aside approval of June 1 meeting minutes for the moment. Okay, and then any other adds or corrections to June 1? Okay. June 12. We spent a lot of time together in June, folks.
Mm-hmm.
June 12. I am too. Sheila, how about you?
Approved.
Okay. So we would add Janet Braun's attendance, please. And pardon me, Councilwoman Braun's attendance. And with that minor adjustment, I had a motion to approve. Do we need to second that? Perfect. Okay, got it. By Quaid, okay. Do we need a roll call or simply acclamation?
I'll take a roll call. Commissioner Finley,
Yes.
Commissioner Quaid,
June 12.
Vice Chair Rossi,
Yes.
Chair Giulioni.
Yes. June 29, again with the amendment, the addition of Councilmember Braun. Any other adds? Okay, any second? Second. Please do a roll call.
Commissioner Finley,
Yes.
Commissioner Quaid, Vice Chair Rossi.
Do I abstain since I wasn't there?
Yes.
Okay, abstain.
And Chair Giulioni.
Yes. Okay. So we will review after you had a chance to take a look at the recording. Suli will
Yes.
review June 1. at the next
There's
meeting.
also May 16 on here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for calling. May 16th. Janet, were you there? I don't remember May 16th. Oh,
That was years ago.
it feels like it, doesn't it? Is this the one we had in the fire station?
No, I think it's just the first.
Okay, yeah, it was the first review, yeah. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, I was there. That's when Sheila was left vice chair, Peter, you were elected.
ah,
That's why we tried to protect.
yeah, we did. So any addition, in addition to adding pardon me, Councilmember Braun, any other additions or corrections? No. Motion to approve? And with the addition of. Okay, a second,
I second.
thank you. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Finley,
Yes.
Commissioner Quaid, Vice Chair Rossi,
Yes.
Chair Giulioni.
Yes. And Fred, you were absent that meeting, so you can't vote.
Okay.
Perfect. Sorry about that. There you go. You take it back. Okay. Oh my. Thank you. It was a very long meeting and a very good meeting. John, so sorry to involve you as much as we had to in the conversation with Bill. The challenges he has with his hearing it causes, this is not a good forum for him. Okay.
He brought to my attention after the meeting, he was saying that the hearing loop was not working, and so that he was having a hard time hearing.
Okay.
That's what he communicated to me after
Terrific.
the meeting. So we'll have to ensure that we don't have that problem again.
Well, I'm just going to say, Esteban, do we talk to you about that, or who do we speak to about that?
We'll bring it up to the clerk's office and they'll speak to someone about it.
Thank you. We really appreciate that. Again, Bill, pardon me, John, we're sorry to drag you into Bill's presentation as much
No,
as
no,
we
not
did.
at all.
You did offer some additional color commentary, and we appreciate it as always. Councilmember Braun.
I just want to say thank you. I will limit my comments to that, given the hour. Thank
Okay.
you.
Cynthia,
No comment.
I will make it perfect. No comments from me either. Declare this meeting closed. It is 9:46, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.
I will do my best. Thank you.